When a wife, abandoned by her husband at a mafia party, unexpectedly reveals an antique silver ring bearing the insignia of the most powerful family that was wiped out, the husband's face turns pale in an instant, because that ring belonged to a family that once dominated the underworld before being massacred. And no one outside that bloodline is allowed to possess it. Today's story will keep you glued to the screen. Watch until the end, and comment with the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. The rain came sideways off the harbor, the kind that stung exposed skin and made the armored SUVs lining the Viscari estate driveway look like black beetles crouched in the dark. Every window in the mansion blazed with golden light, but the warmth stopped at the glass. Inside those walls, warmth was a currency nobody could afford. Lucien Viscari stood in the marble foyer adjusting his cufflinks while 3 bodyguards waited behind him like furniture. He was 34, lean in the jaw, heavy in the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that made dangerous men nervous. His suit cost more than most people earned in 6 months. His eyes cost more than the suit, pale gray, almost colorless, the kind that watched everything and gave back nothing. He checked his watch, not because he cared about the time, because the woman descending the staircase behind him was taking too long, and Lucien Viscari did not wait for anyone. Seraphine appeared at the top of the stairs in a simple black gown. No jewelry except a thin chain at her throat. No makeup beyond what hid the circles beneath her eyes. She moved down the steps with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make herself small inside her own home. Lucien didn't turn around. "The car's been running for 4 minutes," he said. "I'm here," she said quietly. He walked out without acknowledging her. The bodyguards parted. The rain swallowed them both as they crossed to separate vehicles. Lucien to the lead SUV, Seraphine to the one behind it. They hadn't ridden together in 7 months. She'd stopped counting after that. The convoy pulled through the estate gates and wound through the old industrial district toward the waterfront, where the Castellano family owned a converted shipping warehouse now dressed up as a banquet hall. Once a year, the 5 ruling families of the coastal syndicate gathered to drink expensive liquor, broker quiet deals, and remind each other that peace was just another word for nobody shooting first. They called it the syndicate banquet. Everyone else called it the night you kept your mouth shut and your back to the wall. Seraphine pressed her forehead against the cold window and watched the city blur past. 2 years. 2 years she'd lived inside the Viscari mansion like something between a guest and a prisoner. She ate meals alone. She slept in a separate wing. She attended public events when Lucien required a wife on display and vanished into silence the rest of the time. The staff pitied her. The soldiers ignored her. Lucien treated her like a piece of furniture he'd inherited and couldn't be bothered to throw away. She closed her eyes and pressed her thumb against the inside of her left palm, where a small scar ran diagonally across the skin, a habit she'd carried since childhood, a reminder. The convoy arrived. Inside the warehouse, the transformation was grotesque in its elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung from industrial steel beams. White tablecloths stretched across tables surrounded by men whose hands had ended lives. Orchestral music drifted from a string quartet positioned on a raised platform, playing something classical and expensive that nobody was listening to. Seraphine entered through the main doors and immediately felt the shift. Every pair of eyes in the room tracked to the entrance. Not for her, but for the woman walking 3 steps behind Lucien. Viviana De Luca. She wore a blood-red silk dress cut low across the chest and high along the thigh. Her dark hair swept over one shoulder in a wave that probably took 2 hours and a team of 4. She moved with the aggressive confidence of someone who knew exactly how much damage her presence caused and enjoyed every second of it. Her hand rested on Lucien's arm with the possessive ease of ownership. The room understood instantly. The mistress had been promoted to the main event. Seraphine stood near the entrance for a moment longer than she intended. She watched Lucien guide Viviana toward the head table, watched him pull out a chair for her, watched his hand linger on the small of her back. The gesture was small. The message was enormous. In a room full of men who measured power by who sat where, who touched whom, and who got ignored, Lucien had just announced that his wife was irrelevant. A waiter appeared at Seraphine's elbow. "Mrs. Viscari, your seat is at the far end of the table." She followed him without a word. The far end. Past the capos and their wives, past the underbosses and their girlfriends, past the accountants and lawyers who laundered the blood out of the money. She sat in a chair that might as well have been in a different building, surrounded by empty seats and the faint smell of kitchen grease drifting from behind a service door. She sat. She folded her hands. She breathed. Around her, the banquet unfolded the way it always did. Too much food, too much alcohol, too many smiles hiding too many knives. Toasts were made. Alliances were hinted at. Old grudges were dressed in polite language and swallowed with wine. Lucien held court at the center of the head table, commanding the room without raising his voice, the way his father had taught him. Vittorio Vescari himself wasn't present tonight. The old man had retreated from public events 3 years ago, ruling from the shadows of the family compound outside the city. But his presence filled every corner of the room regardless. The Vescari name was the ceiling and the floor. Everyone walked on it. Nobody looked up. Viviana laughed too loudly at something one of the Castellano captains said. She leaned into Lucien's shoulder. She made sure every woman at the table saw her do it. Then she looked down the length of the table at Seraphine and smiled. Seraphine met her gaze without expression. 2 years of practice had given her a face like polished stone. Nothing entered. Nothing escaped. She picked up her water glass and drank slowly while Viviana whispered something to the woman beside her, and both of them laughed. The evening dragged toward its middle act. Dinner plates were cleared. Dessert arrived. The string quartet shifted into something slower and more melancholy, as if the music itself knew what was coming. Viviana stood from the table and picked up a champagne flute, moving through the crowd like a blade wrapped in red silk. She stopped beside servers. She complimented wives of other bosses with the precise insincerity of someone marking territory. And then, as if guided by some instinct for cruelty that functioned like a compass, she drifted toward the far end of the table, toward Seraphine. "You look tired," Viviana said, standing over her. Seraphine looked up. "I'm fine." "You should really eat more. You're practically disappearing." Viviana tilted her head with theatrical concern. "Then again, I suppose you don't have much of an appetite these days." The women at nearby tables pretended not to listen. The men pretended harder. "Lucien mentioned you've been redecorating the East Wing," Viviana continued, swirling her champagne. "I told him it was sweet, keeping yourself busy. Everyone needs a hobby when they've got nothing else to fill their time." Seraphine said nothing. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. Beneath the table, her thumb pressed into the scar on her palm, hard enough to turn the skin white. Viviana leaned closer. Her perfume was heavy and floral, the kind designed to announce itself from across a room. "Between us," she whispered, loud enough for the nearest 6 people to hear, "I think he keeps you around out of pity. Some men collect art they'll never hang. Lucien collects wives he'll never touch." A ripple of discomfort moved through the nearby guests. Someone cleared their throat. A fork clinked against a plate too loudly. Then Viviana did it. She tilted her champagne glass with a wrist movement so precise it couldn't possibly have been an accident. The pale gold liquid cascaded down the front of Seraphine's black gown, soaking through the fabric across her chest and lap. "Oh," Viviana said, pressing her free hand to her mouth with exaggerated horror. "I'm so clumsy tonight." The nearest guests froze. Every eye within 20 feet locked onto the scene. At the far end of the table, one of the Castellano captains slowly set down his fork and leaned back, reading the room with the practiced instinct of a man who'd survived 3 decades in the business by knowing exactly when to stop watching and start moving toward the exit. Seraphine didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or stand or reach for a napkin. She sat perfectly still as champagne dripped from the fabric onto the floor beneath her chair, her hands still folded, her breath measured, her face absolutely empty. Then she lifted her left hand, not to wipe the champagne, not to push back from the table. She lifted it slowly, deliberately, with the controlled grace of someone revealing a card they'd held for years. And the silver ring on her finger caught the chandelier light like a flare. It was old, older than anything in the room. An ancient band of tarnished silver etched with a symbol most people in the syndicate had only ever seen in photographs. A coiled serpent devouring its own tail, surrounded by 5-pointed stars arranged in a pattern that hadn't been used in over 2 decades. The Moretti crest. For 3 full seconds, nobody breathed. The first person to react was Don Castellano himself. The old man was 71, half deaf in his left ear, and moved like his bones were made of chalk. But when he saw that ring, he pushed back from the table so fast his chair scraped against the stone floor with a sound like a scream. He stared at Seraphine's hand with an expression that belonged to a man watching a coffin lid slide open from the inside. Whispers erupted. The name traveled through the room like fire through dry grass. Moretti. 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 Soldiers stiffened against the walls. Captains reached instinctively toward concealed weapons. The string quartet faltered, then stopped entirely, their bows hovering above the strings as if the music itself had been shot dead. At the head of the table, Lucien turned. He saw the ring, and the color drained from his face so completely that for one terrible instant he looked like a corpse propped up in an expensive suit. Viviana, still standing over Seraphine with her empty champagne glass, looked between the ring and the room full of terrified faces with genuine confusion. She didn't understand. She didn't know the name. She didn't know that 25 years ago, the Moretti family controlled every dock, every shipping lane, every backroom deal from the harbor to the state line. She didn't know that the Vescari rise to power began the night an entire bloodline was slaughtered in their beds. But Lucien knew. He knew because his father told him the story every year on the anniversary like a prayer. How the old king had to fall so the new king could rise. How the Morettis were weak, sentimental, unfit to lead. How the blood that was spilled was necessary, inevitable, righteous. And he knew because his father always ended the story the same way. We killed them all, every last one, the children too. Except the ring on Seraphine's finger said otherwise. Lucien crossed the banquet floor in 6 strides. Guests parted around him like water breaking against the hull of a ship. He stopped directly in front of Seraphine and stared down at her with an expression caught between fury, terror, and something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Confusion. "Where did you get that?" he said. Not a question. A demand scraped raw from somewhere deep in his chest. Seraphine looked up at him, the mask she'd worn for 2 years. The quiet wife, the invisible woman, the ghost haunting the edges of his empire, cracked just enough to let something ancient and furious bleed through. "It's mine," she said. "That's not possible." It was always mine. Lucien's jaw worked. His hands hung at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling. Behind him, 3 of his most senior captains had moved into flanking positions without being asked, their hands inside their jackets, their eyes scanning the room for threats that hadn't materialized yet, but felt inevitable. "You told me your father was a politician," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a register that usually preceded violence. "You told me your family was nothing." Seraphine stood. She rose from her champagne-soaked chair with the unhurried authority of someone who had waited a very long time for this exact moment. The black gown clung to her frame, wet and heavy, but she wore the damage like armor. She was shorter than Lucien by half a foot. She weighed less than most of the men in the room by 80 pounds. And in that moment, she was the most dangerous person in the building. "My father was nothing," she said evenly. "Because your father made sure of it." The silence in the room became a physical thing, dense, suffocating, pressing against eardrums like a change in altitude. Even the kitchen staff had stopped moving behind the service doors. Viviana, still clutching her empty champagne glass, took a half step backward. She still didn't fully understand what was happening, but her survival instincts had finally caught up to the room's collective terror. She opened her mouth to say something. "Shut up," Lucien said without looking at her. The words came out flat and mechanical, stripped of everything except raw command. Viviana's mouth closed. Don Castellano leaned toward his consigliere and whispered something that made the man's face go gray. Across the table, the Fontana family's underboss was already texting beneath the tablecloth, his thumbs moving with the desperate speed of a man reporting a natural disaster. Lucien grabbed Seraphine's wrist, not gently, and turned the ring toward the light. His thumb traced the engraving, the coiled serpent, the 5 stars. The inscription around the inner band that he couldn't read in the low light but didn't need to, because his father had described it to him 100 times. Only blood may wear it. Only death may take it. He released her wrist like it had burned him. "We're leaving," he said. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "We are leaving, now." He turned toward the nearest exit, expecting her to follow. She didn't move. "Lucien." He stopped. The way she said his name was different, not the careful, diminished voice she'd used for 2 years. This was older, harder, shaped by something that had nothing to do with their marriage and everything to do with the world that existed before it. "I didn't come here tonight to cause a scene," she said. "I came here because I'm finished hiding, and you need to understand what that means before we walk out of this room." He turned back to her. The room watched. Every soldier, every captain, every boss and underboss and wife and mistress held their breath like spectators at an execution. "What does it mean?" Lucien said. Seraphine looked at him with eyes that had carried a dead family's weight for 25 years. "It means I know what your father did. I know how he did it. I know who helped him. And I know where the bodies are buried. Literally, Lucien, not figuratively. I have names, dates, locations. I have the financial records your father thought he destroyed. I have the original banking codes that your family has been trying to access for 2 decades. She paused. "And I have been inside your house for 2 years. The implication landed like a grenade. Lucien's mind raced. 2 years. 2 years she'd lived inside his walls, walked his corridors, breathed the same air as his most private conversations. She'd been there when captains reported. She'd been there when shipments were discussed. She'd been there during phone calls Lucien took in his study at midnight, assuming the quiet wife upstairs was asleep. 2 years of intelligence, 2 years of access, 2 years of patience so extreme it bordered on something inhuman. Lucien stared at the woman he'd married, humiliated, neglected, and discarded, and for the first time understood that he had never once been in control. Behind him, Viviana's face had gone white. She backed away from the scene, her heels clicking too fast on the stone floor, retreating toward the bar where 2 of the Castellano soldiers stood watching with their arms crossed. "You used me," Lucien said. "You used me first. I married you for leverage, and I married you for access. At least I'm honest about it now." His hand twitched toward his waist. Instinct, not intention, and 4 of his bodyguards immediately tensed. But Lucien wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was reaching for something to hold on to, something solid, because the floor beneath his entire life had just opened into a chasm. "If you have what you say you have," Lucien said slowly, "then every family in this room wants you dead by morning." "Not every family," Seraphine said. "Some of them want your father dead more." The words hit the room like a second shockwave. At the Castellano table, the old Don closed his eyes and pressed his fingers together as if in calculation. The Fontana underboss stopped texting. The Ricci family's youngest captain, a woman named Greta, who'd earned her seat at the table through 3 years of brutal dock wars, leaned forward with the sharp attention of a hawk, sighting movement below. Lucien understood then. This wasn't a confession. This was a declaration of war. And Seraphine hadn't revealed the ring by accident. She'd chosen this room, this night, this audience, every major power in the syndicate gathered in one place, to announce that the ghost the Viscari family thought they'd buried had been alive inside their house the entire time. He looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time since the night they married. The thin chain at her throat, the circles under her eyes, the scar on her palm she always pressed when she was thinking. The way she stood now, balanced, centered, her weight distributed evenly across both feet like someone trained to move in any direction at a moment's notice. How had he missed it? How had he looked at this woman every day for 2 years and seen nothing but a quiet wife in a black dress? "Because she wanted you to see nothing," a voice whispered in his skull. "Because she was better at this than you ever were." "We need to talk," he said. Alone. "Yes," Seraphine said. "We do." She turned and walked toward the private exit behind the service corridor. She didn't wait for him. She didn't look back. She moved through the room full of the most powerful criminals on the eastern seaboard like they were furniture, and not a single one of them tried to stop her. Lucien followed. Behind them, the syndicate banquet erupted into chaos. Phones appeared, voices rose, chairs scraped. Alliances that had held for years began to fracture in real time as every family in the room recalculated the math of power. Viviana De Luca stood alone beside the bar, champagne still wet on her fingers, staring at the empty doorway through which the woman she'd just humiliated had walked out like a queen exiting a throne room. She picked up a fresh glass of champagne and drank it in one swallow. Her hand was shaking. Lucian caught up with Seraphine in the narrow service hallway that connected the banquet floor to a private observatory the Castellano family used for quiet meetings. It was a glass-walled room cantilevered over the harbor, with nothing between you and the black water below but a floor of reinforced windows and the kind of silence that made your own heartbeat sound like artillery. He closed the door behind them. The city skyline burned across the harbor. Neon, headlights, the distant pulse of a world that had no idea what had just happened in a room full of killers dressed in evening wear. "Start from the beginning, Lucien said. His voice was controlled now, but the control was costing him. A vein pulsed at his temple. His hands gripped the back of a chair hard enough to bleach his knuckles. Seraphine stood at the window, looking out at the water. The rain streaked the glass in diagonal lines that made the city lights blur and bleed. 25 years ago, she said, your father sat across a dinner table from mine and made a toast to friendship. 3 hours later, his soldiers came through the doors of our estate with automatic weapons. My mother died in the hallway. My father died in his study. My 2 brothers died in their beds." She turned to face him. "I survived because the nanny hid me in a laundry chute. I was 4 years old. I spent 3 days in the dark before someone found me." Lucian said nothing. His grip on the chair didn't loosen. "A woman named Ada Corsetti, a former Moretti loyalist, raised me in hiding. False name, false papers, false life. She died when I was 16, but before she died, she gave me the ring and told me everything." "Everything," Lucian repeated. "Everything your father took. Everything he destroyed. Everything he buried. And the one thing he could never find, the access codes to the Moretti International Banking Network. 47 accounts across 9 countries, frozen since the night of the massacre because they require biometric confirmation from the bloodline heir wearing the ring." Lucian's expression shifted. Something complicated and ugly moving beneath the surface, like tectonic plates grinding against each other deep underground. "You're telling me you've had access to the Moretti accounts this entire time?" "I've had the ability to access them. I haven't touched them." "Why not?" Seraphine's eyes held his without wavering. "Because the money was never the point. I didn't survive 25 years in hiding to become rich, Lucien. I survived to find out who opened the gates." "What gates?" "The Moretti estate had military-grade security. Your father couldn't have breached it without someone on the inside disabling the systems. Someone my father trusted completely. Ada told me before she died. She never found out who the traitor was. That's what I've been looking for. That's why I married you." Lucien released the chair and stepped back. He paced the length of the observatory, his reflection following him across the dark glass like a ghost tracking its owner. "My father orchestrated a massacre," he said flatly. "Yes?" "And you married his son to investigate." "Yes. And for 2 years you let me treat you like nothing while you searched my house for evidence." "Yes." He stopped pacing and faced her. "Did you find it?" Seraphine reached into a concealed pocket sewn into the lining of her gown and produced a small black USB drive. "Financial records from the night of the massacre. Communication logs between your father and an unidentified contact who disabled the Moretti security grid. Shipping manifests showing stolen Moretti assets being redistributed through Viscari-controlled channels within 48 hours of the killings." She held the drive in her palm like a weapon. "And a partial voice print of the traitor. Enough to match if I can get close to whoever it was." Lucian stared at the USB drive. His mind was doing the math. Not the emotional math, which was catastrophic, but the strategic math, which was worse. If Seraphine's evidence was real, it didn't just expose his father. It destabilized the foundation of the entire Viscari Empire. Every alliance, every territory, every agreement his family had built in the last quarter century was constructed on the lie that the Morettis were destroyed in a fair war between equals. The truth, that it was a betrayal, a massacre carried out with inside help against an unsuspecting family, would shatter the syndicate's code so fundamentally that even families loyal to the Viscaris would demand blood. And if the other families learned that the Moretti banking network was still accessible. "Who else knows?" Lucy Ian said. "About you. About the ring. About any of this." Seraphine's expression changed. For the first time, something uncertain flickered across her features. "That's the problem," she said. "I was careful. I was patient. I told no one. But 3 weeks ago, someone broke into my private study in the East Wing while you were traveling." Lucian's head snapped up. "Nothing was taken," Seraphine continued, "but my files were accessed. Whoever it was knew exactly where to look and exactly what to copy. They left no fingerprints, no DNA, no digital footprint. Professional. Military-level professional." "Who?" "I don't know, but I know what they took. A partial copy of the communication logs. Enough to confirm that a Moretti heir is alive. Not enough to identify me specifically, but enough to start looking." Lucien's body went very still. The kind of still that preceded either violence or retreat. And in his world, those were often the same thing. "So tonight," he said slowly, "you revealed the ring because hiding was no longer an option. Someone already knows. If I stay invisible, they hunt me in the dark. If I step into the light, at least I control the terms. You just painted a target on yourself in front of the entire syndicate." "I painted a target on us both." The word "us" landed between them with the weight of a dropped anchor. For 2 years, there had been no us. There had been Lucienne and the Empire. There had been Seraphine and the silence. 2 people occupying the same house like strangers sharing a waiting room, each counting the minutes until they could leave. Now, whether he wanted it or not, Lucian Viscari's fate was bound to the woman he'd spent 2 years ignoring. Because if the syndicate learned that a Moretti heir had been living inside the Viscari estate, that Lucian had either harbored her knowingly or been too blind to notice, the consequences would be the same either way. Death. For both of them. "I need to think," Lucian said. "You don't have time to think. Whoever broke into my study has a 3-week head start. They know a Moretti survived. They know she's connected to this house. The ring just confirmed it for anyone who is still guessing. Then what do you want from me?" Seraphine stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine scar on her palm, the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the rigid set of her jaw that held back years of grief compressed into something harder than diamond. "I want you to choose," she said, "right now, tonight, before we leave this room." "Choose what?" "Your father's empire, or the truth." Lucien looked at her. The rain hammered the glass walls around them. The harbor churned black beneath their feet. Somewhere in the banquet hall behind them, the syndicate was already making calls, already moving pieces, already deciding who lived and who died based on what they'd seen tonight. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Then again. Then continuously. A cascade of incoming messages from captains, from allies, from soldiers demanding instructions. He didn't touch it. "If I choose the truth," he said, "my father will try to kill us both." "Yes." "And if I choose the Empire, then I disappear tonight, and everything on this drive goes to every family in the syndicate by sunrise. Your father's secrets, his crimes, everything. And the Viscari name becomes synonymous with betrayal. You'd destroy yourself in the process." "I've been destroyed since I was 4 years old, Lucia. Ça sien. The difference is I've been rebuilding every day since." He stared at her. The phone kept buzzing. The rain kept falling. The city kept burning on the horizon like it always did. Indifferent, relentless, blind. Then a sound cut through the silence that didn't belong. A low, distant concussion. Felt more than heard. The glass walls of the observatory vibrated. The water in a glass on the table trembled. Both of them turned toward the harbor and saw the first explosion rip through the eastern perimeter of the Viscari estate, 6 miles away across the black water. A pillar of fire punching through the rain like a fist through wet paper, followed 2 seconds later by the sound, a deep, rolling thunder that shook the windows and made the chandeliers in the banquet hall behind them chime like funeral bells. Lucien's phone exploded with alerts. Seraphine's hand went to her side, instinct, muscle memory, reaching for something that wasn't there but once had been. Their eyes met, and in that single shared glance, they both understood the same terrible truth. Whoever broke into Seraphine's study hadn't just stolen information, they'd already made their move, and the war had just begun. The explosion's echo was still rolling across the harbor when Lucien moved. He crossed the observatory in 3 strides and hit the door with his shoulder, not waiting for it to open fully, forcing through the gap into the service corridor. Seraphine was 2 steps behind him, not following, moving in parallel, the way soldiers move when they've already agreed on a direction without needing to say it aloud. The hallway was narrow and smelled of kitchen grease and old stone and the faint chemical bite of cleaning solution. Overhead fluorescents buzzed. One of them flickered. Lucien had his phone against his ear before they'd covered 10 feet. "Caruso, talk to me." Static. Then the voice of his head of security came through, fractured and breathless, 3/4 swallowed by background noise, shouting, the deep mechanical whine of something structural failing, what sounded like a second detonation hitting somewhere farther back on the property. "East perimeter wall is gone," Caruso said. "Both guard towers, power's out on the north side. Hold on. We've got bodies at the gatehouse, sir. At least 4. I can't reach the interior team." "How many vehicles inside the compound?" "When you left? 3 support units and the armory detail. I don't know if—" The line dropped. Lucien lowered the phone. His jaw was locked. A muscle twitched beneath his left eye. Small, involuntary. The kind of tell only people who'd watched him long enough would recognize as the thing that happened right before he made a decision that couldn't be unmade. "Your study," he said without turning around. The files they copied. Was there anything in them that could be used to locate the accounts directly? Seraphine's footsteps didn't break rhythm. "No." "The access sequence requires the ring and a biometric scan. The copies were intelligence, who I am, where I've been, not operational keys. So they're not here for the money. Not yet. Tonight they're here to make sure I don't get the chance to use it." They came out of the service corridor into the banquet hall's back anteroom, a holding area lined with coat racks and wheeled carts stacked with unused glassware. Through the thin wall, the banquet floor was audible in full collapse. Voices pitched past the register of concern into something raw, furniture scraping, glass breaking, the grunt and shuffle of large men moving fast. Lucien pushed open the anteroom door and stepped into the banquet hall. It looked like a church that had just been told God wasn't coming. The Castellano table had been abandoned, chairs pushed back at angles, napkins crumpled and tossed, plates left mid-meal. Old Don Castellano himself was being half-carried toward the main exit by 2 of his soldiers, his face the color of old newspaper, his lips moving in what might have been instructions, or might have been something quieter and more private. The Fontana group had formed a defensive cluster near the far wall, 6 men surrounding 2 women with the automatic geometry of people who'd trained for exactly this kind of disorder. At the bar, a pair of soldiers Lucien didn't recognize had positioned themselves with their backs to the bottles and their eyes on the room. Not Vescari men, not Castellano. Their cut too sharp, their stillness too deliberate. Lucien clocked them in half a second and filed the information. Viviana was still there. She was standing near one of the abandoned tables, a fresh champagne flute in her hand that she clearly hadn't drunk from, her face stripped of the performance she'd worn all evening. Without the cruelty and the theater, she looked smaller. Her eyes moved between the exits and the soldiers and the place where Lucien had reappeared, and the calculation behind them was ugly and desperate in equal measure. She saw him and moved immediately. "Lucien, not now." "The Castellano soldiers are saying the estate was hit." "Your estate. They're saying it's—" "I said not now, Viviana." She grabbed his arm. Her grip was stronger than expected. "You don't understand what's happening. I heard them talking, before the explosion. 2 of the men at the bar. They were on the phone with someone, and they said the name—" "What name?" She glanced at Seraphine, then back at Lucien. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, but it's neighboring territory. Moretti, she said. The word landed in the three-person space between them like a stripped wire hitting wet ground. Lucien looked at the two soldiers at the bar. They were watching now, not scanning the room anymore, watching Lucien specifically with the patient, locked-in attention of men who'd been told what their target looked like. Viviana, Lucien said, his voice dropping to a register that was almost gentle. Did you make a call tonight, before the banquet? Did anyone ask you to tell them when I arrived, who I brought, what the seating arrangement was? Viviana's grip on his arm loosened. It wasn't like that, she said. Answer the question. They said it was just information, background. They said you were in danger from someone close to you, and they needed to know your movements to... Who asked you? I don't know his name. He contacted me 6 weeks ago. He said he was working for people who wanted to protect the family from... 6 weeks, Lucien repeated. His voice hadn't changed pitch or volume. That was worse than if it had. 6 weeks ago, you started feeding my movements to someone you'd never met because he told you it was for protection. Viviana's chin lifted, the defensive angle of someone who knew they'd made a catastrophic mistake and was deciding whether to own it or fight it. You never told me anything. You never explained anything. I was just supposed to... You were supposed to stay in your lane. He removed her hand from his arm the way you'd remove a piece of glass from a wound, carefully, completely, with no wasted motion. Go sit somewhere and don't speak to anyone. Lucien, somewhere I can see you. He turned away from her. The two soldiers at the bar had separated, one edging left along the wall, the other holding position. Lucien kept them in his peripheral vision while he moved toward the Fontana cluster. Seraphine stayed at his left shoulder. He noticed she'd taken a steak knife from one of the abandoned place settings somewhere between the anteroom and here. She held it flat against her forearm, concealed but accessible, with the practiced concealment of someone who'd been carrying improvised weapons for a long time. He filed that too. Marco Fontana, the family's underboss, a broad, slope-shouldered man of 50 with a nose that had been broken twice and reset badly both times, stepped away from his cluster as Lucien approached. They'd known each other since they were boys. That meant something. It also meant nothing. Tell me what you know, Lucien said. Marco's eyes flicked to Seraphine, then back to Lucien. Maybe we should talk without... She stays. Marco worked his jaw. The attack on your estate. We're hearing it wasn't random, coordinated from 2 directions, east wall and the service road from the cliffs. Somebody had maps, Lucien. Structural maps. The kind you don't get off the internet. The kind someone inside would have. The kind someone who'd been inside for a long time would have. Marco's voice stayed even, but his eyes were doing something complicated. The room saw the ring. Half these people are already calling home right now. The Ricci captain, Greta. She's been on the phone since the explosion. I don't know whose side she lands on by morning. What are they saying about the ring? Marco looked at him for a long moment. Lucien, are you telling me you didn't know? I'm asking what they're saying. They're saying the Moretti heir is alive. She's been inside your house for 2 years, and either you knew and you've been sitting on a dynasty-level secret, or you didn't know and you're the biggest fool who ever ran an empire. Marco paused. Neither version is good for you. Lucien said nothing. Seraphine spoke. Which version do they prefer? Marco looked at her fully for the first time. He took in the champagne-stained gown, the ring, the knife she wasn't bothering to fully hide anymore, and the particular quality of stillness she carried, the kind that wasn't peace, but was the thing that lived on the far side of a very long war. I remember your family, Marco said quietly. I was 23 when it happened. I was a soldier then, not present, but I remember. Do you remember who opened the gates? Seraphine said. Marco's expression closed like a door. I think, he said carefully, that question is exactly why someone is trying to kill you tonight. A crash from the direction of the main entrance pulled every head in the room. One of the main doors had swung hard against the wall, not opened, hit, the kind of impact that came from someone moving at a run. 3 men in dark tactical gear came through fast and low, weapons up, sweeping the room with the mechanical precision of a military drill, not masked. That was the detail that mattered. Professionals wore masks. These men wanted to be seen, or more specifically, they wanted Lucien to see them and know exactly who sent them. Lucien recognized the cut of their gear, the specific model of earpiece in the left ear, the way they held their weapons tilted 2 degrees off-center, a training quirk from one specific camp outside the city that only one organization used. His stomach dropped. These were his father's men, not rogue soldiers, not a rival family's hit squad. Vittorio Viscari's personal security detail, the unit that answered to no one in the organization except the old man himself, that operated outside the normal chain of command, that had been assembled over 30 years to function as Vittorio's private instrument of last resort, the unit that had carried out the Moretti massacre 25 years ago. Lucien stood in the middle of the banquet hall with the full weight of that understanding settling across his shoulders like something physical. His father had sent them. Not because of the ring. He couldn't have mobilized this fast for something he'd just learned an hour ago. This was planned, staged before tonight. The banquet was the trigger point, not the cause. Which meant Vittorio had already known the Moretti heir was inside the house, and had been waiting. Lucien! Seraphine's voice was right at his ear, low and controlled. The service corridor, back the way we came. There's an underground access point through the kitchen. I found it 2 months ago when I was mapping the building. He looked at her sideways. You mapped the building. I mapped every building I've spent more than a week in since I was 16. There was no version of his old life in which this woman made sense. There was no version of his old understanding of himself in which he'd been anything other than completely, humiliatingly blind. How far does the tunnel run? He said. Far enough. But we need to move now, before they... The soldier nearest the bar fired a single round into the ceiling. The room detonated into screaming. Tables overturned. Glass exploded. The Fontana cluster collapsed inward around their women. Don Castellano's remaining bodyguard threw himself over the old man, both of them going down behind an overturned table. Marco Fontana drew from his waist and had the weapon up in under a second, trained, ready, furious, but held his fire because the geometry was wrong. Too many friendlies in the line. Viscari? The lead soldier called out. His voice was flat, professional. The voice of a man delivering a message, not conducting a conversation. You and the woman, come forward. Lucien didn't move. This is a family matter, the soldier continued. No harm comes to anyone else in this room. We have no quarrel with the families. Step forward, and this ends here. Seraphine's hand found Lucien's wrist in the chaos. Not grabbing, just contact. The specific contact of someone saying, I know where the exit is, follow my lead. He felt the knife handle press against his palm. She'd transferred it without anyone seeing. Now, she breathed. They moved, not toward the main floor, away from it, back through the gap in the overturned furniture, into the shadow behind the bar, into the service corridor entrance before the soldiers could reposition. A shot cracked against the doorframe as it swung shut behind them. High, rushed, the shooter adjusting too late. Plaster dust fell on Lucien's shoulder like snow. They ran. The kitchen was dim and smelled of copper and cooling fat. Stainless steel surfaces reflected them in stretched, silvery distortions as they moved between the prep stations. Seraphine went straight to the far corner without hesitating, dropped to one knee beside a floor-level panel bolted into the base of the far wall, and pulled it open with both hands. The hinges were old and screamed. Down, she said. How did you... Down, Lucien. Now. He went in first, dropping into a low concrete shaft that smelled of standing water and old pipe insulation. Seraphine followed, pulling the panel shut above them. Total darkness. The sounds from above became muffled immediately, wrapped in the dense particular silence of underground stone. Seraphine's hand found his shoulder in the black. She pressed a small object into his palm. A penlight, retrieved from somewhere in that gown that apparently had more hidden pockets than a stage magician's jacket. He clicked it on. The tunnel ran forward in a straight line, barely wide enough for 2 people, with a ceiling that required a slight forward hunch. The walls wept condensation. The floor was wet concrete sloping gently downhill, toward the harbor. They moved. For 2 minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were footsteps and water drip and the distant, muffled percussion of whatever was happening above them. Lucien couldn't tell if those were gunshots or just the building settling under its own ancient weight. Then Lucien said, "He knew." "Yes." "How long?" "I think," Seraphine said, her voice careful and measured, even at a hushed run, "that he's known for approximately 3 weeks, since whoever broke into my study reported back. And he didn't tell me. Would you have handled it differently if he had?" Lucien didn't answer. The question was too clean, too direct, and the answer was too complicated to form words around. He would have gone to Seraphine. He would have asked her to leave. He would have arranged her quiet disappearance in the way the Viscari family arranged all inconveniences, without noise, without evidence, without allowing himself to think too hard about what that meant. That was the honest answer. He hated it. "He sent men to kill you at the banquet," Lucien said, "in front of every family in the syndicate. Whatever happens next, whatever story he tells about tonight, those men in that room were witnesses. The families will want answers." "Your father doesn't need the families anymore," Seraphine said. "If he gets access to the Moretti banking network, he's operating at a scale that makes the syndicate irrelevant. He spent 25 years building toward this. The families, the territories, the alliances, those were scaffolding. The network was always the structure. And the codes. Require me alive and willing, or require the ring on a dead hand, which won't work. The biometric is living tissue verification. I built that protection in 3 years ago when I first accessed the outer shell of the network." Lucien stopped walking. Seraphine took 2 more steps before she stopped and turned. In the thin beam of the penlight, they faced each other in the wet dark. Water ran somewhere behind the walls. Far above them, a long rolling vibration moved through the stone. Another explosion, distant this time, somewhere on the estate grounds. 3 years ago, Lucien said, "you were already building protections into the network 3 years ago." "Yes." "Before we were married?" "Yes." "You planned this, the marriage, the timeline, everything." Seraphine held his gaze. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften. "I identified you as the entry point 18 months before I approached the political connection that introduced us. I researched your habits, your alliances, your blind spots. I engineered the circumstances of our introduction. I arranged to be exactly the kind of woman you'd find useful enough to marry and unimportant enough to ignore." He absorbed this. The quiet politician's daughter. Impeccable, pliable, no family connections to cause complications. A beat. "You never even ran a full background check." "My father's people ran checks." "Your father's people found exactly what I wanted them to find. I had 18 months to build a legend, Lucien. 18 months and the resources of a network that your father has been trying to access for 25 years. Something that wasn't quite bitterness moved through her voice. "I was very thorough." Lucien's back was against the tunnel wall. He was aware of the stone through his jacket, cold and absolute. He was aware that 23 floors above them, men who served his father were hunting them. He was aware that he had a knife in one hand and a penlight in the other, and a wife he didn't know at all standing 3 feet away in a champagne-ruined gown. And he was aware, in the specific way that the body knows things before the mind catches up, that something in his chest had shifted irreversibly in the last hour. That the careful, armored detachment he'd maintained for 34 years, the distance that functioned as both weapon and protection, had developed a crack he couldn't locate precisely, but could feel structurally. He didn't examine it. He filed it the same way he'd filed the knife and the emergency contact. "The traitor," he said, "the one who opened the gates 25 years ago. You said you have a voice print. A partial voice print. Enough to narrow, not confirm. Do you have a list? Suspects. I have 3 names that consistently recur across the financial records and communication logs from that period. People with access. People who benefited." She paused. "One of them is still alive and still connected to your organization." The tunnel felt narrower than it had 30 seconds ago. "Give me the name." "Not yet." "Seraphine. When I know I can trust you with it." I just ran for my father's men with you through a tunnel under the harbor. What does trust look like to you? It looks like a choice you haven't fully made yet." Her voice wasn't harsh. It was accurate in the way that accurate things often hurt. "You said yourself, your father will try to kill us both. You framed it as a consequence I was presenting to you. You haven't said what you're choosing." Above them, the building vibrated again. Dust fell from the ceiling in a thin line. "If I choose your side," Lucian said, "I'm declaring war on my own father. On the structure that built everything I have." "Yes. And there's no version of this where we both survive and the empire stays intact." "No, there isn't." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the water dripping somewhere in the walls filled the silence with something almost rhythmic. "My mother," he said finally. The word came out different from the others, smaller somehow and heavier at the same time. Seraphine went very still. "When she died," Lucian continued, "I was 9 years old. My father told me it was a car accident, a driver who fell asleep. He took me to the funeral in the rain and held my hand at the graveside and cried." He paused. "I never questioned it. Not once. Not in 25 years. Seraphine said nothing. She waited. "The communication logs," Lucian said. "The ones on the drive. Do they go back far enough to Yes. One syllable. Complete." Lucian closed his eyes, opened them. The penlight made deep shadows of the lines around his mouth. "Tell me what happened to her." "Lucienne, tell me." Seraphine exhaled slowly. "Ada Corsetti told me that in the year after the massacre, your mother began asking questions. She found discrepancies in the accounts. She found a document she wasn't supposed to find. She confronted your father privately." A pause. "She didn't die in a car accident." The tunnel was silent except for the water. Lucien's hand tightened around the knife until the tendons in his wrist stood out like cables under skin. "All right, he said. His voice was completely flat, the flatness of a man who has just cauterized something in order to keep walking. "I've made my choice." He pushed off the wall and started moving down the tunnel again. Seraphine followed. They emerged 8 minutes later through a rusted maintenance hatch into the base of a parking structure 2 blocks from the harbor. The rain was still falling, lighter now, a cold mist that clung rather than hammered. The structure was half empty at this hour, fluorescent lights humming in the concrete dark. Their footsteps echoed off the low ceiling. Lucien was already calling Caruso back before they reached the first level of parked cars. This time the call connected. "Tell me you're out of the estate," Lucien said. "Out and mobile." Caruso sounded like a man who'd been running. 6 of us. 3 vehicles. I lost contact with the interior team. I don't know how many we have left inside. Sir, the attack came from 2 directions simultaneously, and the men... I recognize one of them, Lucien. One of the men leading the assault. He's Vittorio's unit. I know. Silence on the line. "He sent the order before the banquet," Caruso said slowly, the implication arriving in real time in his voice. "He sent the order before any of tonight happened. Meet me at the secondary location, the Pellegrino warehouse on the South Dock, 2 hours. Copy. And is Mrs. Vescari? She's with me." Another silence. More weighted this time. "Copy," Caruso said again, and disconnected. Seraphine was standing at the parking structure's edge, looking out at the rain-hazed city, the harbor barely visible between buildings, the faint orange smear on the horizon where the estate fire was still burning against the cloud cover. She'd found a dry jacket somewhere, draped over a car's side mirror, probably abandoned, and pulled it over the ruined gown. It was 2 sizes too large and made her look like someone in the aftermath of something terrible, which was accurate. "The Pellegrino warehouse," she said without turning around. "I know that location." "Of course you do." "It's defensible. Single entrance, loading dock in the back, roof access, good sight lines. I know what it is. I've used it for 20 years. "So has your father." Lucien stopped. Seraphine turned. Her expression was careful. Not alarmed. She'd passed alarmed somewhere around the second explosion. This was the specific precision of someone laying out a problem before it became a crisis. The secondary locations in your organization, she said. How many people know them? My senior captains, Caruso, logistics team. And your father's unit. The cold that moved through Lucien then had nothing to do with the rain. He pulled the phone back out. Caruso picked up on the second ring. Change of plan, Lucien said. Not the warehouse. He stopped, ran through the list of locations in his head, eliminating each one by the same metric. His father's access, his father's knowledge, 25 years of a son who never questioned where the old man got his information. The Vora building, the sub-basement, you know it. A pause. That's not a location I have on record. Exactly, 2 hours. He hung up. Seraphine was watching him with something approaching. Not respect, not yet, but its precursor. The look of someone revising an estimate. We need a vehicle, Lucien said. 3rd level. Blue sedan, older model, no GPS chip installed. I can tell by the antenna mount. Keys are probably above the visor. He looked at her. I've been making contingency plans for this city since before you married me, she said simply. He almost said something. Instead, he turned and walked toward the elevator, and she fell into step beside him, and for the first time in 2 years of cohabitation, the distance between them was something chosen rather than imposed. They were in the stairwell between the 2nd and 3rd levels, when Lucien's phone lit up with an incoming call. The number on the screen was one he'd had memorized since childhood, but hadn't seen call him directly in 11 years. Vittorio Vescari. Lucien stopped on the landing, stared at the screen. The phone buzzed in his hand like a trapped insect. Seraphine looked at the screen. Her face went very still. You don't have to answer, she said. If I don't answer, he knows I've chosen. And if you do? Lucien looked at the screen for another 2 seconds. Then he answered and pressed the phone to his ear. Father. The voice on the other end was old but not weak. It had the quality of something that had been refined over decades into the purest possible version of itself. Patient, precise, and utterly without sentiment. Lucien, Vittorio Vescari said, come home. The estate is on fire. Not that home. Come to the compound. We need to talk about the woman you've brought into our family. Lucien's eyes were on Seraphine. She was watching his face with the focused attention of someone reading a document they can't touch. What about her? Lucien said. She's not who she told you she was. I know. A brief pause. The first pause his father had taken. How long have you known? Long enough. Then you understand what needs to happen. Lucien said nothing. Son. The word came out shaped wrong, tooled into something functional rather than felt. What she carries will destroy everything we've built, everything your grandfather built, everything I've given my life to preserve. She is the single point of collapse for this entire empire, and she has been living inside your house, inside our house. Our house, Lucien repeated. Come to the compound. Bring her. We'll handle this quietly without... You sent your unit to the banquet, Father. The pause this time was longer. I sent them to protect... Don't! The word came out with a force that surprised even Lucien, quiet but absolute, the sound of a door being closed from the inside. Don't construct a sentence around that. Not with me. Not tonight. Vittorio Vescari was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, the patience in his voice had become something else, something colder and more fundamental, the way water becomes ice. The same substance, transformed into something that cuts. You're making a mistake, he said. A mistake you will not survive. Maybe. She has made you sentimental. She's done exactly what she came to do. I don't blame you. It's a competent play. But sentimentality is a luxury the head of this family. I'm not calling because I want your permission, Lucien said. I'm calling so you hear it from me directly. Whatever comes next, you'll know it wasn't a surprise. You'll know I looked you in the eyes when I said it. Silence. I'm coming for the truth, Lucien said. All of it, including my mother. The line went dead. Lucien lowered the phone. The stairwell hummed with the ambient mechanical breath of the building around them. Ventilation, distant traffic, The muffled sound of rain on concrete somewhere above. Seraphine hadn't moved. "He'll mobilize everything he has," she said. "Every unit, every loyal captain, every favor he's accumulated over 50 years. Yes. We have Caruso and 5 soldiers and a partial evidence package, and a car with no GPS. Yes. And you just told him we're coming? Yes. She studied him. Why? Lucian pocketed the phone and started up the stairs toward the 3rd level. Because my father has spent his entire life teaching me that power means never having to announce yourself, he said. That the only move worth making is the one nobody sees coming. He pushed through the stairwell door onto the 3rd level, into the fluorescent hum and the smell of oil and exhaust. I wanted him to know that I'm not him. Seraphine came through the door behind him and let it close. In the harsh overhead light, she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had survived something that should have killed her, who had spent 25 years building toward this single point, who was now standing inside it with a champagne-stained gown under a stolen jacket and a silver ring on her finger that had just ended whatever remained of the old world. She didn't look triumphant. She looked exhausted in the way that only people carrying long grief looked exhausted. Bone-deep, structural, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. 3rd row, she said. Blue sedan. They walked toward it through the empty parking level, and somewhere behind them and above them and all around them, the city that had been built on a massacre and a lie began. Finally, irreversibly. The blue sedan smelled of pine air freshener and old coffee and someone else's life. Lucian drove. Seraphine sat in the passenger seat with the USB drive in her closed fist and her eyes on the side mirror, watching the parking structure recede into the rain-misted dark behind them. The stolen jacket was still too large across her shoulders. The champagne had dried into the fabric of her gown and left a faint, sour residue that she could smell every time she shifted her weight. She didn't move more than necessary. The city at 2 in the morning had a particular quality. Not empty, never empty, but thinned. Traffic lights cycling for nobody. Storefronts dark behind security grills. A group of 3 men outside a closed bar, smoking in the rain without speaking. The harbor visible in flashes between buildings, black and restless. The fire at the estate ground still faintly visible as an orange seam on the horizon where the sky met the water. The Vora building, Seraphine said. Tell me about the sub-basement. Underground access. Reinforced. My grandfather used it during the territorial conflicts in the 70s as a command position. It's been maintained, but not on any organizational record. I found it when I was 17. My grandfather showed me before he died. I never told my father. You're certain you never told him? I'm certain of very few things tonight. That's one of them. She accepted this without comment and went back to watching the mirror. They drove for 11 minutes through the wet streets before Lucien turned into the industrial district south of the financial quarter, a neighborhood of converted warehouses and shipping offices, and the kind of businesses that didn't put their names on signs. The Vora building was a 6-story concrete structure that had been a textile factory in the 40s and an import logistics company in the 80s, and nothing identifiable since. It still had the original freight elevator. It still had the original sub-basement, accessible through a service shaft behind what used to be the boiler room on the ground floor. Lucian parked the sedan 2 blocks away. They walked the rest through the rain. Caruso was already there with 4 men. He'd lost one in the extraction from the estate, a soldier named Pierre who'd been with the organization for 12 years and had a daughter in the 3rd grade. Caruso mentioned this once in a single flat sentence and then didn't mention it again. That was the grammar of grief in their world. You said the name once so it was on the record, and then you moved because stopping meant dying. The sub-basement was low-ceilinged and smelled of concrete dust and machine oil. Bare bulbs on pull-chain fixtures. A folding table someone had left down here a decade ago, scarred and tilted on one bad leg. Caruso had brought a laptop and a portable transmitter. 2 of the soldiers stood at the shaft access. The other 2 positioned themselves at opposite corners with the economical attention of men who'd done this kind of thing before. Lucien set the USB drive on the table. Everything on this drive, he said to Caruso, needs to be copied, split across 3 separate encrypted locations, and the originals held physically on your person, not in the vehicle, on you. Caruso looked at the drive, then at Seraphine, then at Lucien with the expression of a man who had loyally served a family for 20 years and was now understanding in real time that the family was not what he'd believed it to be. "How bad?" Caruso said. "Bad enough that my father sent his personal unit to the banquet tonight." Caruso sat down slowly. He was a big man, ex-military, with hands that had never fully lost their calluses and a face that generally functioned as a wall. The wall was showing cracks. He was going to have us both handled quietly and blamed the Moretti name for whatever needed explaining afterward. Lucien pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "The drive has financial records and communication logs going back 25 years. We need to establish whether the evidence is legally actionable, organizationally actionable, or both. Legally actionable means prosecutors." "Yes." "That's... Lucien, if this goes to prosecutors, the entire organization, I know what it means. Your father built... I know what he built, Caruso. I know what he built it on." His voice stayed level, but something under it had the quality of tension in a cable just before it snaps. "Run the drive." Caruso ran the drive. While he worked, Seraphine stood at the far wall with her arms crossed and her thumb pressing into the scar on her palm in that private, repetitive way she had. Lucien watched her without appearing to. He catalogued the small things, the way she favored her left side when she stood, which suggested an old injury on the right she'd never mentioned. The way her eyes moved in a room, always returning to exits in sequence rather than randomly. The particular quality of her stillness, which wasn't the stillness of someone at rest, but the stillness of someone conserving energy for something ahead. 2 years. He had eaten breakfast 15 feet from this woman. He had passed her in hallways. He had sat at the same dinner table on the 4 occasions per year when appearances required it, and made small, hollow conversation about nothing, and looked at her face and seen nothing. He wondered now what she had been thinking during those dinners, what calculations were running beneath the surface while she asked polite questions about his week and listened to his answers with that careful, diminished attention she'd constructed like a costume. He decided he didn't want to know. Or rather, he knew he'd need to know eventually, for strategic reasons, but he was aware that the knowing would cost him something he hadn't fully budgeted for. "I've got the financial layer open," Caruso said, leaning toward the laptop screen. He scrolled in silence for 30 seconds. His expression changed by increments, the way a landscape changes as you drive deeper into something, first just different, then wrong, then actively alarming. "These transaction records, these are moving through Vescari shell accounts. I recognize the routing structures, but the originating accounts..." He stopped. "Say it," Lucien said. "The originating accounts are Moretti. These are Moretti assets being absorbed into Vescari infrastructure within..." He checked the timestamps. 72 hours of the massacre. That's not opportunistic. You can't set up absorption channels in 72 hours. These were built in advance. Yes. He planned it for months, at minimum. He was building the absorption infrastructure while your families were still publicly allied. Yes. Caruso sat back. He pressed the heels of both hands against his eyes briefly. A gesture Lucien had never seen from him before. The gesture of a man recalibrating something fundamental. The men who've been running our Eastern dock operations for the last 20 years. The revenue from the portside contracts. The Veltri import licenses. He lowered his hands. All of it runs back to this. To what he took. All of it, Lucien confirmed. That means the families know. If this evidence surfaces, the families will understand that the Vescari fortune isn't built on Vescari work. It's built on stolen infrastructure. And the families have been operating inside that infrastructure, taking their percentages, thinking they were benefiting from legitimate territorial expansion. Caruso's voice had found a new register. Not panic, which wasn't in his operational vocabulary, but a precise, focused dread. They'll want blood, Lucien. Every family in the syndicate. Not just your father's blood, the family's blood. The name. I know. And you still want to move forward. We don't have a choice. The evidence exists whether we act on it or not. My father knows she has it. He'll burn everything to get it back, and he'll burn us both in the process. Lucien's hands were flat on the table. The only play is to move before he consolidates. Make the evidence the weapon instead of letting it be the motive for our funerals. Caruso looked at Seraphine. How long have you had this? The documents? Seraphine's voice came from across the room, steady and uninflected. Physical copies for 8 years, digital for 3. The banking records were the hardest to reconstruct. I had to work backward through 9 intermediary accounts. 8 years! Caruso absorbed this. You've been sitting on evidence that could have toppled this organization for 8 years. I wasn't trying to topple the organization, she said. I was looking for a name. The traitor. The person who opened my family's gates. Caruso looked back at the screen. He navigated to a different section of the drive. The communication logs, Lucien assumed, the partial voice print data, and began reading. His scrolling slowed, then stopped. His hand went very still on the trackpad. Seraphine, Caruso said. His voice had changed. Something in it had gone careful in the way voices go careful when they're carrying something fragile and dangerous. These communication logs. The party designated as the internal contact, the person who disabled the Moretti security grid. What about them? Seraphine said. The voice print sample you flagged here. The partial analysis. It's a 63% match to a voice in the Viscari organizational database. Not enough to prosecute, enough to investigate. It's not in the Viscari organizational database, Caruso said. Seraphine crossed the room in 4 strides and leaned over the laptop. She looked at the screen. Her face was very still. That's the wrong file path, she said. Those logs should be cross-referenced against T. I'm not looking at the cross-reference, Caruso said quietly. I ran an independent comparison while you were talking. The voice print in your sample, so I ran it against a different database, a private one that I maintain for my own operational security. He looked up at her. Seraphine, I've been in this organization for 20 years. I've sat in a lot of rooms with a lot of people. I keep records. The room had gone completely quiet. The 2 soldiers at the shaft access were studiously not looking at the table. The 2 in the corners hadn't moved. Tell me, Seraphine said. Her voice had flattened to something that was barely voice at all, a frequency below speech. Caruso turned the laptop toward her. She looked at the screen. Lucien watched her face. He'd seen people receive catastrophic information before. He'd been in the room for deaths, betrayals, financial ruin, the specific devastation of men learning that everything they'd built had collapsed. He knew the topography of shock, the initial blankness, the system's offline quality of a face that's processing something too large to immediately metabolize. Seraphine's face didn't go blank. It went somewhere worse than blank. It went somewhere very old. The specific expression of someone who has spent 25 years building a theory and has just found the piece that makes the whole picture coherent in the worst possible way. The expression of someone who almost knew, who kept one specific corner of their understanding deliberately unexamined because some part of them recognized that the answer there was not survivable. Her hand, flat on the table beside the laptop, closed slowly into a fist. Say the name, Lucien said. Seraphine straightened. She stepped back from the laptop. She pressed her closed fist against her sternum. Not a dramatic gesture, just a person applying pressure to the place where something had just broken, and she breathed, slow, deliberate. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the specific breathing of someone who learned controlled respiration as a tactical skill rather than a wellness practice. Ada Corsetti, she said. The name meant nothing to Lucien. It meant nothing to Caruso. It meant nothing to the soldiers. It meant everything to Seraphine. The woman who raised you, Lucien said slowly. The woman who hid me in the laundry chute. Seraphine's voice was perfectly controlled. The control was costing her something visible. A slight tension across her jaw, a whitening around the closed fist at her sternum. The woman who told me she was a Moretti loyalist, who gave me the ring, who spent 12 years raising me and telling me the story of my family's massacre and building in me the architecture of everything I became, every skill, every contingency, every She stopped. She started again. The voice print, she said. Ada Corsetti was the internal contact. Ada Corsetti disabled the security grid. Ada Corsetti opened the gates. The silence was complete. She died, Seraphine continued in the same controlled frequency. When I was 16, she told me it was cancer. She gave me the ring and the beginning of the financial records and the name Vittorio Vescari, and she sent me into the world to find justice for my family. And then she died, and I spent 9 years grieving her and being grateful for her and using everything she gave me. Her fist tightened against her chest. And she was the one who let them in. Lucian said nothing. There was nothing to say that would function as anything other than noise. She didn't disappear, Seraphine said. She wasn't dying of cancer. She was being protected. Your father protected her. She helped him kill my family, and he hid her somewhere and gave her a new identity, and she surfaced long enough to take the one surviving child of the family she destroyed and spend 12 years making sure that child would grow up to be exactly the kind of weapon your father could never predict and never defend against. A long pause. Or maybe she had a conscience after all. Maybe she spent those 12 years trying to make right the things she did. Maybe she genuinely loved me. The last sentence came out in a register that was different from all the others, stripped of the control briefly, just for a syllable, before she pulled it back. It doesn't change what she did, Lucien said. No, Seraphine agreed. It doesn't. And it doesn't change the evidence. No. She lowered her fist from her chest, unclenched it, looked at the scar on her palm with an expression that was reviewing something it had always believed to mean one thing and was now understanding meant another. It only changes the question I've been asking. What question? I thought I was looking for the person who betrayed my family so I could confront them. I've been building toward a confrontation for 25 years. The moment I stand in front of whoever opened those gates and make them acknowledge what they did. Her voice was steady again. The furnace door closed. But Ada is dead. The confrontation I built my life toward is impossible, which means everything I thought I was working toward was... The evidence is still real, Caruso said. He said it with the blunt practicality of someone preventing a structural collapse by putting something solid in the gap. What Ada did doesn't negate the documents. Vittorio still ordered the massacre. The financial crimes still exist. The murder of Lucien's mother still... He stopped. Looked at Lucien. Lucien had gone still in a different way from Seraphine's stillness. Where hers was managed, controlled, the stillness of someone maintaining form under pressure, his was the stillness of a man who had just felt the ground shift under him for the second time in one night and was deciding with cold precision whether to let himself feel that or file it and continue. He filed it. There's still the question of who's alive, Lucien said. Ada Corsetti is dead. My father is alive. The organizational crimes are still active. The network is still locked. He looked at Seraphine. Your mission is structurally intact. My mission, Seraphine repeated, with a faint inflection on the word that contained more complexity than a single sentence could hold. The confrontation you built toward was with a dead woman who may or may not have been trying to help you in the end. I can't fix that for you. But the architecture you built is still sound. The evidence, the network access, the leverage against the families. He held her gaze. We still have the same position we had an hour ago. Do we? She looked at him. Because an hour ago I believed I understood the shape of what was done to my family. I understood who the enemy was and where the betrayal came from and what justice looked like. Now I'm standing in a basement with a dead woman's ring on my finger and the knowledge that the person I trusted most in the world handed my family to the slaughter. She paused. The shape of everything has changed. The target hasn't. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, a small, stripped-down gesture that wasn't agreement exactly, but was the pragmatic acknowledgement of someone accepting the field conditions and continuing the operation. The voice print data, she said, turning back to Caruso. Can you pull the full communication logs from the night of the massacre? The ones that show the timing of the security grid failure. Caruso navigated. I've got them. The grid failure happened at 11:47 p.m. The assault began at midnight. That's a 13-minute window. In 13 minutes, your father's unit crossed 2 miles of coastal terrain and breached the estate. She leaned over the screen again. That kind of precision doesn't come from the attack side. Someone inside the estate was also coordinating the assault team's approach, directing them past the blind spots in the grounds. Ada would have known the grounds, Lucy said. Ada would have known every inch of them. She'd worked for my family for 6 years. Seraphine scrolled through the logs. But she was a domestic employee. She wouldn't have had the tactical vocabulary to direct a military assault. Her scrolling stopped. She had a contact inside the assault team, someone embedded in your father's unit who she was in direct communication with during the 13-minute window. Caruso leaned in. There's a second number in the communication thread. Yes. Seraphine's voice had taken on the specific quality of someone following a thread into a dark room, knowing what they're likely to find at the end and moving forward anyway. Pull the number, Caruso typed. Ran the trace. The laptop hummed. The result came back in 40 seconds. Caruso read it. His expression did something complicated. That number, he said carefully, is registered to a communications account that was decommissioned 18 years ago. The account holder, he stopped. Say it, Lucien said. Caruso looked at him with something in his face that Lucien had never seen there before in 20 years of working alongside each other. Something that looked almost like sorrow. The account holder, Caruso said, is Renata Foss. The name landed in the room. Lucien knew the name. Everyone in the senior organization knew the name. Renata Foss was Vittorio Viscari's personal legal counsel, had been for 31 years. She was 70 years old, small and impeccably dressed, with white hair and wire-rimmed glasses and the specific authority of a woman who had outlasted every rival in her field through sheer precision. She attended organizational meetings from a position of total trust. She had access to every legal structure, every shell company, every financial instrument the Viscari organization had ever constructed. She attended organizational meetings. Lucien's mind went back 2 years. 1 year, 6 months. Specific moments, specific rooms, specific conversations he'd had in his own home with his captains present, with Caruso present, with the legal team present, with Renata Foss present, with Seraphine somewhere else in the house, presumably. Or not presumably. Not presumably at all now. Seraphine had been mapping the building. Seraphine had been documenting conversations, accessing files, building the case that was sitting on a USB drive on a tilted table in this basement. She would have documented Renata Foss in that process. She would have encountered the name. But Ada Corsetti's revelation had just inverted the entire framework Seraphine used to interpret her collected intelligence. Everything she thought pointed toward Vittorio as the sole architect of the massacre. Every document, every log, every piece of evidence she'd spent years assembling, had been assembled through the lens of a woman who was herself complicit, who had directed Seraphine's attention, who had controlled what Seraphine found. Ada didn't just open the gates, Seraphine said. Her voice was very quiet now, not the controlled quiet of earlier. The quiet of someone recalculating at speed, moving through the implications of a structural revelation with the grim efficiency of someone who can't afford to stop. She shaped my investigation. For 12 years, she shaped the frame through which I would eventually look at everything. She told me which records mattered, which names to focus on, which questions to ask. She built the lens I used to see. And Renata Foss, Lucien said, was never in that lens. Seraphine looked at the ceiling for a brief moment. Not an appeal to anything, just the physical act of a person whose thoughts need more space than the middle distance provides. Ada directed me toward your father as the sole decision-maker, the lone architect, the monster at the center. And Vittorio is guilty. The records confirm that, absolutely. But Renata Foss has been inside this organization for 31 years, Caruso said. She knows every legal weakness, every financial structure, every exposure point. A pause. And she was in the room 6 weeks ago when I briefed the senior team about the East Wing security upgrade. The room went very still. Lucien looked at Caruso. The East Wing security upgrade, Lucien said, which included an updated inventory of access points to the private studies. Caruso's face confirmed it before he spoke. She was in the room, he said. I didn't think... She's always in the room. She's been in the room for 30 years. She knew about Seraphine's study, Lucian said, the specific location, the access point. She was the one who broke in, Seraphine said. Not a question. A conclusion arrived at through a locked door that had just swung open. Renata Foss broke into my study 3 weeks ago. Not one of your father's soldiers. Her, or someone she directed with specific knowledge only she could have provided. And then she reported to my father, Lucien said, that a Moretti heir was alive in the house, triggering the mobilization we saw tonight. The three of them stood around the laptop in the low light of the sub-basement and understood simultaneously that the last 3 weeks, the break-in, the banquet, the attack on the estate, the escalation of everything, traced back to a 70-year-old woman in wire-rimmed glasses who had been sitting in organizational meetings for 3 decades and waiting with a patience that made Seraphine's 25 years of planning look impulsive. "Where is she now?" Lucien said. Caruso typed, "Check the organizational location system, a private tracking protocol for senior members, voluntary but near universally used because the organization functioned on knowing where its key people were at any given moment." She checked out of the system at 10 p.m., Caruso said, before the banquet, before the explosion. "She knew the timeline," Seraphine said. "She knew what was going to happen tonight, and she stepped off the grid before it started. Which means she's mobile and she's operating independently of the normal organizational structure." Lucian straightened. "And she knows what's on that drive. She knows roughly what's on the drive. She copied a partial set of documents, the full contents, the banking access protocols, the complete communication logs. Those she doesn't have. But she knows they exist. Yes, and if she gets to my father before we do, she'll give him everything she copied. He'll use it to justify eliminating us both as a threat to organizational security, and the narrative becomes 2 rogue elements, the criminal heir and the disloyal son, who destabilized the syndicate and were dealt with accordingly." Seraphine looked at Lucien with the flat, clear eyes of someone presenting a situation report without sentiment. And then they wait for the ring to surface on a dead hand and try to crack the biometric, which they can't, but they'll try. Lucien absorbed this. He turned to Caruso. "How long to secure the drive copies and go mobile?" 8 minutes. "Do it in 5. Caruso began moving. The soldiers responded to the shift in tempo without being told, redistributing their positions toward the exit, checking equipment, moving with the compressed efficiency of professionals who understood that the window had just changed dimensions. Seraphine remained standing at the table. She was looking at the USB drive. "She raised me," she said. Not to Lucien specifically, to the room, to the record, to whatever internal accounting she was conducting in the part of herself that still hadn't fully processed the night's central devastation. She taught me how to run contingency plans in strange cities. She taught me to map buildings and memorize exits and read voice prints. She gave me the ring. She gave me every skill I used to get inside your house. She built me into exactly the instrument that could do what she apparently needed done. Get close enough to the Vescari organization to access the evidence, establish a foothold inside the family itself. A long pause. And I can't tell if that was love or manipulation or both at the same time. I can't tell if she was trying to make amends or if I was a tool she built for a purpose I still don't fully understand. Does it change what you do next? Lucien said. She looked at him. No. Then figure the rest out later. I know. She picked up the drive and closed her hand around it. I know. A sound from above, the shaft access, the soldiers tensing, hands moving, and then Caruso's voice from across the room. We've got a vehicle outside, 2 up on the north approach. Ours or theirs, Lucien said. Caruso was looking at his phone. Neither. It's a single sedan, running dark. He looked up. Lucien, the plate is registered to the Fontana organization. Marco Fontana. Lucien's mind moved fast. Marco at the banquet. Marco who'd seen the ring, who'd understood the implications, who'd been on his phone with people Lucien didn't know. Marco who'd said, I remember your family to Seraphine, and closed like a door when she asked about the gates. He followed us, Seraphine said. From the parking structure, Lucien confirmed, or from the banquet. He had enough time to, He stopped. He said he remembered the Moretti family. He was in the organization 25 years ago. He was a soldier. Seraphine turned toward him slowly. He was a soldier, she repeated, during the massacre. Yes. Who's been a senior underboss in the Fontana organization for 20 years. Yes. Who had access to organizational intelligence across multiple families. Seraphine, the communication logs, she said. The second number, Caruso. Run the account holder again, full historical trace. Not just the registered name, the usage pattern, where the calls were placed from, what towers they pinged. Caruso was already typing. Upstairs, through the shaft access, they could all hear the soft percussion of footsteps. Careful footsteps. One person moving with deliberate quiet through the floor above them, not rushing, not searching, moving with the specific directional confidence of someone who already knows where they're going. Someone who'd been here before. The usage pattern came back on Caruso's screen. Caruso read it. He looked at Seraphine. He looked at Lucian. The calls were placed from 3 locations, he said. The Moretti estate. The Castellano waterfront office. He paused for the length of a breath. And the Fontana family's primary compound. The footsteps above them stopped, directly above the shaft access panel. In the sub-basement, every soldier had their weapon out. Caruso had moved behind the laptop with his hand inside his jacket. Lucien stood in the center of the room with the knife from the banquet still on his person, and the cold, crystalline clarity of a man who has just finished receiving all the information the night intended to give him and is now in the part that comes after understanding. The shaft panel opened. Marco Fontana came down the ladder with his hands visible, moving slowly, making it theatrical how empty his palms were. He was still in his banquet clothes, the dark suit now damp from the rain outside, his tie loosened, his broken twice nose red from the cold. He looked older in the sub-basement light than he had in the chandeliered warmth of the banquet hall. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had arrived at the place where he intended to set it down. He reached the bottom of the ladder and turned around. 6 weapons pointed at him from 6 angles. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood there and looked at Seraphine with an expression that was the most honest thing Lucien had seen on anyone's face all night. You found Ada's name, Marco said. Seraphine didn't answer. I knew you would eventually, Marco continued. I told her years ago. I told her the one thing she couldn't control was what you'd find after she was gone. She said it didn't matter. She said by the time you found it, the work would be done. He looked at the ring on Seraphine's finger. She was almost right. You were in the communication thread, Seraphine said. The night of the massacre. The second number. Yes. You were part of it. I was 23 years old, and I was a soldier who did what I was told. He said it without defensiveness, which was its own kind of confession. I directed the assault team past the blind spots. I was on Ada's phone because I was the unit's internal coordinator, and she needed real-time confirmation of my position. He looked at his hands briefly. I've spent 25 years knowing that. I've spent 25 years watching Vittorio Viscari build an empire on what we did and doing the math on what that made me. It made you an accessory to the murder of my entire family, Seraphine said. Yes. No qualification. No deflection. It did. And you've spent 25 years as an underboss in a rival family collecting intelligence and waiting for, what, absolution? Information, Marco said. I've been collecting information, the same information you've been collecting from the outside. I knew Renata Foss was the architect. Then tell me what I don't know, Seraphine said. Her voice had gone very cold. The cold of someone who has burned through grief and shock and arrived somewhere beyond both. The stripped-down, weaponized clarity of a person with nothing left to protect. Tell me something that justifies you standing in front of me right now instead of the alternative. Marco reached slowly inside his jacket. Every weapon in the room tracked the movement. He produced a small, water-stained envelope and held it out towards Seraphine. Ada gave me that before she died, he said. She told me to find you after it was over, after you'd done what she built you to do. She said you'd need what's inside. He paused. She said she was sorry, for whatever that's worth. Seraphine looked at the envelope for a long moment without taking it. Then she crossed the room, took it from his hand, and opened it. Inside was a single folded page. She read it. Her face didn't change. Her face was the controlled, impenetrable surface it had learned to be 25 years ago in a laundry chute in the dark. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the concealed pocket of her gown, next to where the USB drive had been. "What does it say?" Lucian said. Seraphine looked at Marco. "The Moretti banking network, the access protocols. Ada had a secondary key, a parallel biometric authorization built into the system before the massacre, a failsafe." She looked at the envelope in her pocket. She gave Marco the override sequence, the one that allows the accounts to be accessed without the ring. The room absorbed this. "She built a back door," Caruso said slowly. "She built a back door," Seraphine confirmed, "which means the accounts were never as secure as I believed, which means that anyone with the override sequence, anyone Ada might have shared it with before she died, anyone Marco might have shared it with, could have accessed the network at any time." She looked at Marco. "Who else has that sequence?" she said. Marco's expression shifted. For the first time since he'd come down the ladder, something in it was not composed. "I've kept it for 25 years, he said. "I've told no one." "But Renata Foss knew Ada had a failsafe," Seraphine said. "She would have known. She was architectural. She would have built contingencies for the contingencies." "If Renata knows a back door exists," Lucian began. "She's been looking for it," Seraphine said. "For 25 years she's been looking for it. And tonight—" She stopped. Her eyes went to Marco. "Tonight you came here," she said. "You followed us here. You found this location. I followed you from the parking structure. How did you find the parking structure?" Marco's mouth opened, closed. "Marco," Lucian said. His voice had dropped to the register it went before violence. "How did you find the parking structure?" There was a signal, a tracker on the sedan. I placed it at the banquet venue's parking level before—" "You tracked us," Seraphine said. "And you came here, to this building, and you came down that shaft. To help you, while Renata Foss is mobile and off-grid and looking for the backdoor sequence." Seraphine's voice was very quiet now. "And you are the only person who has it." Marco looked at her. In the low light of the sub-basement, with 6 weapons still pointed at him and a tilted table between them and the letter from a dead woman folded in her pocket, Marco Fontana's face did something it probably hadn't done in a very long time. It showed fear. "She has already contacted me," he said, "before I came here. Renata called me 3 hours ago. She said she knew I had the sequence. She said if I brought it to her voluntarily, she could protect me from what was coming." "And you said," Lucian said. "I didn't answer." Marco looked at his hands. "I didn't answer. I came here instead." "But she knows you're looking for Seraphine," Lucian said. "She knows you're trying to make contact." "She'll anticipate that I bring the sequence here," Seraphine said. She wasn't asking. She was laying out the architecture of what had just happened, the play within the play, the move that had been made before any of them understood the board. "She'll have followed you, Marco, or she'll have put someone on you the moment you didn't call back." Marco looked up at the shaft access above him, at the ceiling, at the floor they'd all just been standing on, while someone outside in the rain had been watching this building and counting the minutes, and Lucian was already moving toward the shaft. He was halfway up the ladder when the first vehicle's headlights swept through the grimy ground-level windows of the building above, and the sound of multiple car doors opening hit the night air like a— Lucian hit the ground floor running. The building above the sub-basement was a gutted industrial floor. Stripped concrete columns, empty loading bays, 20 years of accumulated debris pushed to the walls in dark masses. 3 of the ground-level windows faced the north approach, and through the cracked and grimy glass the headlights of 2 vehicles swept wide arcs across the wet street outside, the beams catching the rain in moving curtains of silver. Not 2 vehicles. 3. The third was coming from the east, running without headlights, engine barely audible until it was already in position across the building's service entrance. Lucian counted the geometry in under 2 seconds and moved away from the windows. Caruso came up through the shaft behind him with the laptop bag across one shoulder and his weapon drawn. Then one soldier, then another. Seraphine came up fourth, moving with the low center of gravity efficiency he'd clocked at the banquet and understood better now. Someone trained to move fast in confined spaces, to stay below the instinctive aim line of someone startled into shooting. Marco came last, slower, his age showing in the way he took the ladder, but his face had resolved into something functional and grim. 6, minimum, Lucien said quietly. Probably 9. The east vehicle is a blocking position. Exits, Caruso said. Loading bay on the south face. There's a freight door. Original, steel, manual crank. If it hasn't seized in 20 years. Lucien was already moving south through the dark. Stay low, stay tight. They moved through the building in a loose file. Lucien on point, Seraphine second, 2 soldiers behind her. Caruso covering the rear with Marco between him and the soldiers. No flashlights. The ambient rain light from the windows was enough to navigate by if you moved slowly. They didn't move slowly. The south freight door was a rolling steel curtain mounted on a ceiling track, operated by a hand crank on the right side that had been painted over twice and hadn't been touched in at least a decade. Lucien found it by feel in the dark and tried it. The mechanism resisted, corroded, stiff, the crank groaning under pressure like something waking from a long sleep. Here, Seraphine said behind him. She put both hands on the crank beside his. They turned it together. The door shrieked. Not loud, but loud enough. A short metallic complaint that traveled through the building's structure and would have been audible to anyone standing outside with their attention focused inward. Move, Lucien said. The door had opened 18 inches. Enough. Seraphine went through first, sideways, low, and Lucien was through after her, then the soldiers, then Caruso, then Marco. The south face of the building opened onto a narrow service alley between the Vora structure and the neighboring warehouse, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, running parallel to the main street. Rain hit them immediately, cold, steady, the kind that had been falling long enough to have soaked everything and was now just adding to the weight of it. The alley surface was black water over cracked asphalt. Their footsteps were loud despite themselves. Lucien looked both ways. East end of the alley, the blocking vehicle, its nose just visible at the alley's mouth, engine running. West end, darkness, a street lamp out, a gap between buildings that led to the loading district's secondary road network. West, he said. They went west at a run. They made it 40 feet before the east end of the alley produced 2 figures that came around the Vora building's corner at a run, having heard the freight door, having anticipated the south exit. One of them had a weapon up before he'd fully cleared the corner. The shot came high and left. A rushed shot, the geometry wrong, the shooter adjusting for movement, and hit the alley wall above Seraphine's head in a burst of concrete dust. The 2 rear soldiers swung and returned fire in the same instant, 2 shots each, controlled pairs, the specific economy of men who'd been trained to the point where muscle memory ran the action while the brain ran threat assessment. The first figure went down. The second retreated behind the building's corner, and the exchange became suppressive, disciplined, holding the rear while the rest of the group continued moving. Lucien didn't stop. Stopping was dying. He grabbed Seraphine's arm. Not pulling, just contact. The same contact she'd used on him in the banquet hall stairwell, directional communication at a run. And they covered the remaining length of the alley and came out onto the secondary road. The road was empty. The secondary loading district at 3 a.m. was as close to abandoned as this part of the city got. A skeletal landscape of industrial gates and locked loading bays, and the occasional parked heavy truck sitting dark and massive as beached boats. Behind them, 2 more shots from the alley. Then silence. Then the sound of running footsteps. Their soldiers, catching up, one of them with a hand pressed to his left arm where something had caught him, not stopping, moving. How bad? Caruso said, as the soldier reached them. Through and through, the soldier said. I can move. Move then, Lucien said. They moved. Caruso was on his phone as they ran, speaking in the compressed code of operational communication, calling in the 2 additional soldiers who'd been left as mobile backup 2 blocks from the Vora building's designated entrance. Lucien had sent them wide on arrival. Old habit, the kind his father had drilled into him at 14 years old. Never arrive at a location with all your assets committed to a single approach. Always keep a reserve. His father had taught him that. He ran with the thought of his father in his chest like a foreign object, something that didn't belong but couldn't yet be removed. The backup vehicles met them at the intersection of Harbor Lane and Dock Street. 2 sedans, his men, fresh weapons, a field kit for the wounded soldier. They transferred in under 90 seconds, the kind of fluid organized motion that came from years of this exact choreography. Lucien took the lead vehicle with Seraphine and Marco. Caruso took the second with the soldiers. They drove south. "Where are we going?" Marco said from the back seat. "You know this city's underground infrastructure," Lucien said. Not a question. "Some of it." "The old Moretti Cathedral." Silence from the back seat. Lucien looked in the rear-view mirror. Marco's face in the intermittent streetlight was the face of a man who'd just heard a word he'd been avoiding for 25 years. "Nobody's been in that place since the original syndicate fell apart." "I know, my father told me about it. He said it was buried under the dock extension project in the 90s. He said it was inaccessible." "He told you that," Marco said. "Was he lying?" A long pause. "The dock extension project was real. The construction went over it. But the cathedral itself, the original foundation, it's still there. The Moretti family built it 200 years ago. The foundation goes down 4 stories. The construction went around it, not through it. Too structurally complex to demolish." Marco paused. "There's an access point through the old drainage system under Pier 17. "Show us," Seraphine said from the passenger seat. Marco looked at her in the mirror. "You want to go there?" he said. "Of all places. My father's empire started there. This ends there." Her voice was flat and absolute. "Show us the access." Marco looked out the window at the passing city. His reflection in the glass looked like what he was. A man 25 years past the worst decision of his life, finally arriving at wherever that decision had always been taking him. "Take the Pier 17 service road," he said. "I'll show you the hatch." They drove. Seraphine kept her eyes forward. Her right hand was in her lap, closed around nothing visible. But Lucien could see the slight movement of her thumb against her palm. The scar, the habit, the private calibration she performed when she was running calculations that had no clean answer. "The letter," Lucien said. "Ada's letter." "Not now." "Seraphine, it's personal." Her voice came out flat and final. "It doesn't affect the operation." "Everything affects the operation." She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then, she apologized. She explained herself. She said she made a choice she believed was the only choice available to her, and she spent 12 years trying to... She said raising me was... She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "It was a letter from someone who loved me and betrayed my family, and spent 12 years trying to balance those 2 things without ever telling me the truth. And now she's dead, and I can't..." Another stop. "It doesn't affect the operation." Lucien said nothing. He watched the road. After a moment, she said, very quietly, "She called me her daughter." In the letter. "She called me her daughter, and she asked me to not let what she did define everything that came after." The car was silent. "I don't know what to do with that," Seraphine said. "No," Lucien said. "I don't either." She looked at him briefly. Not with warmth. Nothing about tonight had left room for warmth. But with the specific recognition of someone who has heard an honest answer when they expected deflection. She looked back at the road. Pier 17 service road was unpaved and unlit, a maintenance access track running along the base of the dock extension's concrete support columns. The water was close here, audible, the harbor running fast with the night's rain, slapping against the pylons with an irregular wet percussion that had no pattern and no calm. Marco directed them to a maintenance access panel set into the base of one of the larger support columns, a steel hatch, original construction, accessible with a manual release lever that Marco clearly knew by feel in the dark. He'd been here before. Recently, Lucien judged, by the way the mechanism released without resistance. The drainage system beneath was exactly as miserable as drainage systems always are. Low ceiling, moving water 6 inches deep across the floor, the smell of harbor sediment and old metal, and the specific damp cold that accumulates in underground spaces near water. They used the penlight again. Seraphine's penlight, still in her possession, still functioning. Marco led from the front. He knew the way, turning at junctions that looked identical without hesitation, ducking under pipe runs with the rehearsed avoidance of someone who'd made this route multiple times. Lucian stayed close behind him, watching his hands, watching the shape of his shoulders, reading the body language of a man navigating through something geographic and psychological at the same time. They walked for 7 minutes. The cathedral announced itself before they reached it. A change in the air pressure, a deepening of the space around them, the acoustic shift from tight pipe tunnel to something larger that absorbed sound differently. Then the tunnel opened into a chamber, and the chamber was enormous. The foundation of the Moretti Cathedral was 4 stories of cut stone sunk into the bedrock beneath the harbor district. The original structure above had been demolished and built over, but down here the bones remained intact. Massive stone arches spanning a vaulted ceiling, the outlines of what had once been a significant underground space still readable in the architecture. Water had come in over the decades. The stone floor was covered in several inches of standing water that reflected the penlight in broken, shifting patterns. The walls were damp and dark, and in places had been taken over by the slow creep of mineral deposits that looked in the thin light like frozen waterfalls. At the far end of the space, where the main hall would once have flowed into whatever had served as its most significant interior space, a set of stone steps rose from the flooded floor to a raised platform that the water hadn't yet reached. Kept dry by some engineering of the original construction, the platform sitting 6 inches above the waterline, its stone surface dark and cold but solid. What stood on the platform stopped all of them at the tunnel's mouth. Vittorio Vescari was already there. He stood at the platform's center with the stillness of a man who had arrived first and intended that fact to carry meaning. He was 71, shorter than Lucien remembered, age compressing what had once been a commanding physical presence. But his bearing was intact, the particular uprightness of a man who had never, in 7 decades, permitted his body to express doubt. His gray suit was immaculate despite the hour and the weather. His hands were clasped behind his back. His face in the penlight's reach was exactly as Lucian knew it. The strong jaw, the pale eyes, the expression of complete settled authority that had defined every room Vittorio Vescari had ever entered. Flanking him on both sides, positioned back along the platform's edges with weapons drawn, were 6 members of his personal unit, the same operators from the banquet, or their equivalents, indistinguishable in the dark in their tactical gear, with their faces impassive and their sightlines covering every approach. And standing 3 feet to Vittorio's left, in a dark coat with her white hair precise and her wire-rimmed glasses catching the light, was Renata Foss. She held a tablet in her hands. On the screen, visible even at this distance, was what appeared to be a financial interface, account structures, access fields, the architecture of the Moretti banking network's outer shell. She'd found the back door, or Marco had led them here to complete the delivery. Every weapon in the hands of Lucien's soldiers swung up simultaneously. Every weapon on Vittorio's side was already drawn. The cathedral's flooded interior became an intersection of kill lines so thoroughly overlapping that any shot fired would begin a cascade that left nobody standing, nobody fired. "Lucien," Vittorio said, his voice carried across the stone chamber with the ease of a man accustomed to speaking in large spaces and having people listen. "Put them down." "Your men first," Lucien said. "I don't negotiate with my own son." "Tonight you do." A long pause. The water moved beneath them. The stone breathed cold against their faces. "You found this place faster than I expected," Vittorio said. "I've been here 2 hours." "How?" "I've known about the access through Pier 17 since your grandfather showed me, the same way he showed you about the Vora building." The faintest inflection, not warmth, nothing that could be called warmth, but the specific note of a man who'd paid attention to his son's movements across a lifetime. "I know all your hiding places, Lucian. I always have." Seraphine stepped forward from the group. She moved through the standing water without hesitating. 6 inches of cold black water, soaking through her shoes immediately, and she moved through it like it was pavement. She stopped at the base of the platform steps. Vittorio looked down at her. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. You look like your mother, he said finally. Seraphine's jaw tightened. Don't. Elena Moretti had the same way of standing, the weight distribution. She was trained the same way by the same people. It runs in the bloodline. Don't talk about my mother. I liked Elena, Vittorio said, with the casual cruelty of someone deploying a fact precisely because they know it will damage. I liked your entire family, in fact. Your father was brilliant. His operation was elegant. The problem was that elegance doesn't survive contact with necessity. And the network, he gestured slightly toward Renata and the tablet. The network was too important to leave in the hands of a family that would eventually choose principle over pragmatism. So you killed them, Seraphine said. I made a strategic decision. You murdered my mother in her hallway and my brothers in their beds, and you called my father brilliant while you did it. Yes, Vittorio said, simply, without architecture around it. I did. The admission landed in the stone chamber and the water and the dark. Not because anyone in the room was surprised by it, they were past surprise, but because of the quality of the silence that followed it, the way an acknowledged truth occupied different space than a suspected one. Lucien stared at his father. He'd been staring at his father for the last 3 minutes, and the thing happening in his chest had moved past the filing stage and into something that couldn't be managed by the same mechanisms. 25 years of a story told one way. A massacre called a war. A murdered woman called a car accident. A stolen empire called an inheritance. My mother, Lucien said. Vittorio turned his gaze to his son. The authority in his face didn't waver. She found the Moretti account records, Vittorio said. She understood what they meant. She asked me to give it back, Lucien. She asked me to return the network access to the surviving heir. She'd found the child, the girl in hiding, Ada's girl. She wanted to return it and end the exposure. He paused. I couldn't allow that. She was your wife. She was a liability. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into water. The ripples it sent through Lucien's face were visible for exactly 2 seconds before he locked it down. The jaw, the eyes, the breath. And what replaced the expression was something that had no civilian name, something that lived entirely in the register of men who had run out of the kind of patience that civilization is built on. Renata, Vittorio said without looking at her. Where are we with the access? Renata Foss looked up from the tablet. Her voice, when she spoke, had the crisp precision of a woman who operated in an entirely different emotional register from everyone else in the room. Practical, clipped, technically focused. The backdoor sequence Marco provided is authentic. We're through the outer shell. The secondary verification layer requires the ring, Seraphine said. Renata looked at her. The ring, or a sufficient biometric substitute. We're working on... You're not working on anything, Seraphine said, because there is no substitute. I built the verification layer myself. It requires living tissue from the bloodline. You can take the ring from my hand when I'm dead, and it will return a null read and lock the accounts permanently. You need me alive and willing. Then we have a negotiation, Vittorio said. We have nothing, Seraphine said. You want justice. Or you call it justice. What you actually want is acknowledgement. You want someone to stand in front of you and say, yes, it happened. Yes, it was us. Yes, the blood was real. I've done that. Take it and give me the access. And then what? And then you leave. You take whatever money you want from the accounts. It's substantial. And you build a life somewhere that isn't this city with that money and whatever peace you can find. And Lucien, Vittorio's eyes moved to his son, comes home. In the stone chamber with water around their ankles and weapons drawn in every direction, the word home sounded like a language nobody in the room still spoke. He killed your mother, Seraphine said. She wasn't saying it to hurt Lucien. She was saying it because it was the load-bearing truth of the moment, and she didn't believe in letting load-bearing truths go unnamed. I know, Lucien said. Lucien. Vittorio's voice shifted register, something that was not quite appeal, but lived in its neighborhood. Everything I built for you. The territories, the alliances, the network, all of it passes to you. Everything I took from the Morettis, everything I've spent 50 years constructing, it belongs to you. That's not justification, that's fact. You are the only person I've ever built anything for. Including my mother's funeral, Lucian said. Yes, including that. You held my hand in the rain. Yes. You cried. The faintest pause. Yes. Were you crying for her or for the situation? Vittorio didn't answer. Lucian looked at his father and understood then, not for the first time tonight, but for the first time completely, that the man standing on the platform 20 feet away across black water was a stranger who had raised him, and that the raising had been careful and deliberate and entirely oriented toward the production of a successor rather than the formation of a son. That every hard lesson and every drilled discipline and every piece of strategic wisdom had been the maintenance of a tool, not the love of a child. He'd known this on some level for 34 years. He'd filed it. He'd operated from it. He'd let it shape him into exactly what it was designed to shape him into. He was done being shaped. Lower your weapons, Lucian said to his men. Caruso looked at him sharply. Lower them. His men lowered. Not all the way. To the mid-carry position, weapons at waist height, still technically accessible but no longer in the face of the room. Vittorio nodded once and gestured to his unit. They lowered in kind. The forest of weapons retracted from the air of the chamber, and suddenly the space felt larger and more dangerous at the same time. The threat still present, but no longer mapped to specific objects, diffused into the air itself. Lucien walked forward, through the water, up the platform steps, until he stood on the elevated stone surface with his father and Renata Foss and the two nearest members of Vittorio's unit. He was 2 feet from Vittorio, close enough to see the details of his face at this hour. The fine lines, the gray at the temples, the particular color of his eyes, which were the same color as Lucien's own. The network, Lucien said quietly. The accounts. The entire Moretti financial infrastructure. He looked at Renata's tablet. What's the combined asset value? Renata glanced at Vittorio. He nodded. Current valuation, given 25 years of frozen growth across 9 jurisdictions, Renata said, is approximately 4.3 billion. The number settled into the room. And what you've built with the infrastructure you stole as scaffolding, Lucian said to his father. The territories, the operations, the legitimate business layer? Combined? Substantially more. The network was the foundation. The operational empire is the structure. And you want it to pass to me. It was always going to pass to you. On the condition that Seraphine grants access and disappears. On the condition that this ends tonight without further— No, Lucien said. Vittorio's expression shifted, just slightly. The first genuine uncertainty Lucien had seen on that face in 34 years of looking at it. The access, Lucien continued, belongs to Seraphine. The network belongs to the Moretti heir. The financial infrastructure built on the assets stolen from her family belongs legally, organizationally, morally, to her. His voice was steady and completely without heat, the tone of a man reading a final verdict. The operational empire my grandfather built and you extended, we dismantled the criminal structure and transitioned the legitimate businesses into clean incorporation, under her oversight and mine jointly. You're not serious. The evidence on that drive goes to federal prosecutors and to every family in the syndicate simultaneously unless those conditions are accepted. Not as a threat, as a consequence. The evidence exists. It will surface. The only question is whether it surfaces inside a negotiated transition or in a way that leaves nothing standing. Vittorio stared at his son. You'd destroy everything, he said. You destroyed everything first. I'm just deciding what gets built on the ground. Renata Foss moved, not toward Vittorio, away from him. 2 quick steps toward the platform's edge, the tablet clutched against her chest, her eyes making the rapid calculation of a woman who had survived 50 years in dangerous rooms by knowing precisely when to stop being the person in the center of one. She was moving toward the nearest of Vittorio's unit men, not for protection, Lucien recognized too late, for coordination, for the specific body language of someone triggering a prearranged signal. Seraphine was already moving when Lucien saw it. She came up the platform steps in 3 strides, crossing the 6 feet between herself and Renata, in the time it took the older woman to raise the tablet and speak a single word into it. A word that wasn't speech, was a code, was a trigger command for something wired into the building's structure at a depth that said, Renata Foss had been planning this specific location for a very long time. Seraphine hit her with a shoulder tackle that drove both women sideways across the platform, the tablet spinning from Renata's hands, skidding across the wet stone and dropping off the platform's edge into the water with a flat splash. But the command had already been sent. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the detonation charges Renata had placed in the cathedral's foundation, small, shaped, targeted to specific structural points in the ancient stone that she'd spent 25 years studying, waiting to use, fired in sequence. The first took out the south wall's main arch support. The stone came down in a cascade that filled the south end of the chamber with a roaring cloud of dust and fractured rock, blocking the tunnel access through which they'd entered. The second charge hit the ceiling's central vault, not collapsing it, targeted more precisely than that, at the specific load transfer points that held the vault's water barrier intact. The ceiling cracked, and the harbor came in. Not a flood, not immediately, but the sound of it was the sound of something that would become a flood in minutes. A low surging roar from above as the pressurized water found the fractures in the stone and began working them wider with the patient, absolute force of water that has been waiting for 25 years to reclaim the ground beneath it. The chamber became chaos. Vittorio's unit moved, 3 of them toward their principal, 3 toward the exits, the professional partitioning of a security detail under structural threat. Lucien's soldiers moved in counter. The space between the 2 groups collapsed, and the engagement became close quarters, brutal and fast. Not the choreographed exchange of a gunfight at range, but the grinding, gasping violence of men fighting in confined space with water rising around their feet and stone raining from above. Lucien went for the nearest of Vittorio's men, a big soldier, broader across the shoulders, who came in hard with a weapon that Lucien got both hands on before it could orient. They went into the wall together, the impact sending chips of ancient stone onto both their shoulders, the weapon between them a contested object that neither could fully control. Lucien took an elbow to the jaw that snapped his head sideways and flooded his vision with white noise for a half-second, long enough for the soldier to shift his weight. And then Lucien drove a knee up hard into the man's midsection and felt the grip on the weapon slacken and ripped it free. He didn't use it. He used it as an extension of his arm, driving the butt end into the soldier's temple with a precision that dropped him without the sound of a shot that would have disoriented everyone in the chamber. The water was at his shins now. Rising fast, the harbor finding its level through the cracked vault overhead, cold enough to make the muscles in his legs seize momentarily with every step. Seraphine had Renata Foss pinned against the edge of the platform, not violently, but with the irreversible containment of someone who has physically superior position and the training to maintain it. Renata was struggling, her wire-rimmed glasses gone somewhere in the scuffle, her precise white hair disheveled, and her face, stripped of the professional composure that had served as her armor for 50 years, showed something that was partly calculation and partly the thing beneath calculation, which was the fear of a woman who'd finally been caught by the consequences of a decision made decades ago. "The detonator," Seraphine said. "Secondary charges." "Where?" "There are no secondary charges," Renata said. "It was only—" "Don't." Seraphine's voice was flat. "You don't take a position like this without a contingency. Where?" Renata looked at her. She looked at the rising water. She looked at the stone ceiling where the fractures were spreading visibly, hairline cracks running along the ancient mortar lines like a map being drawn in real time. "East column," Renata said. "Base. Manual detonator clipped to the rebar. If the first charges hadn't accomplished..." Seraphine was already off her and moving. Lucien scanned the chamber. Caruso had one of Vittorio's men neutralized and was moving to support the wounded soldier. Marco Fontana was pressed against the north wall, not fighting, not running, just present, standing in the rising water with the expression of a man witnessing a reckoning he'd been waiting 25 years to see completed. 2 of Vittorio's men were still functional, both moving toward their principal, toward Vittorio, who had retreated to the platform's highest point as the water climbed. He stood there with the precision of his bearing intact, and his hands now visible, and a weapon in his right hand that he held at his side rather than raised, as if raising it would be a concession to a situation he refused to fully acknowledge. Lucien crossed the platform toward his father through the water that was now at knee height and rising with a momentum that said they had minutes before the chamber became unsurvivable. The two unit men moved to intercept. Caruso took one from the left side. Pure impact, 220 pounds of ex-military coming in fast, driving the man off his feet and into the water in a collision that sent a wave across the chamber floor. The second man got between Lucien and Vittorio and raised his weapon, and Lucien looked at it and didn't slow down. And the man looked at Lucien's face and made a decision. The decision that men sometimes make when they recognize in another person's expression something that transcends tactical calculation, some absolute quality of commitment that makes the gun in their hand feel less certain than it did a moment ago. He stepped aside. Lucien came to stand in front of his father. They were the same height, the same pale eyes. The water swirled around their knees in the broken cathedral of a family his father had murdered, and the ceiling groaned above them. And somewhere in the chamber the sound of Seraphine moving toward the east column was audible in the gaps between the water's voice. Vittorio looked at his son. "Put it down," Lucien said, nodding at the weapon in his father's hand. And then we finish the conversation. The conversation is finished." Vittorio's voice was still the same voice, the patient, refined authority, the instrument of 50 years of total confidence. But something underneath it had changed, a tension that wasn't there before, the specific tension of a structure that has lost one of its key load-bearing points and is redistributing weight to compensate. "You put a gun in my hand at 14 years old," Lucien said. "You taught me that power was the only currency that didn't depreciate. You taught me that sentiment was a liability, and that loyalty was a tool, and that love was what weak men used to justify losing." He looked at his father's face. "And then you held my hand at my mother's grave and cried." Vittorio was silent. "I've been trying to figure out which one was the performance," Lucien said. "The lessons or the grief." "They were both real," Vittorio said. And for the first time, the certainty in his voice was doing the work that certainty does when it's compensating for something absent rather than expressing something present. "That's what you don't understand. That's what you've never—" "I understand exactly," Lucien said. "You loved her and you killed her, and you were capable of holding both of those things in the same hand without it destroying you. That's not strength. That's the specific damage of a man who decided something was more important than everything else and then spent 50 years making the rest of the world pay for that decision." Water hit the platform edge. Cold, black, inevitable. Vittorio raised the weapon, not at Lucien, past him, toward Seraphine at the east column, and in the fractured, flooding ruin of the Moretti Cathedral, as the stone cracked above and the harbor pressed in through the dark, Lucien Vescari made the choice that had been building since a girl in a champagne-soaked dress lifted her hand in a banquet hall and showed a room full of killers who she really was. He stepped directly into the line of fire, between his father's weapon and Seraphine's back. "Lucien!" Vittorio's voice broke on the word, a sound that had no precedent in 34 years of listening to his father speak, a crack in the instrument. "Put it down," Lucien said, "or pull the trigger. Those are the only two things left." The water climbed. The ceiling groaned. Vittorio Vescari looked at his son standing in front of his weapon, in the flooding ruins of a dynasty built on blood, and his hand, for the first time in 50 years of decisions made without trembling. Vittorio's hand trembled. It lasted less than 2 seconds. A tremor so small that any other man in any other room would have missed it entirely. But Lucien had spent 34 years reading his father's body the way a sailor reads weather, for the small signs that announced what the large ones hadn't yet arrived at. And the tremor in Vittorio Vescari's gun hand was the most significant thing Lucien had ever seen him do. It was the first involuntary thing. The weapon didn't lower, but it didn't fire. Behind Lucien, at the east column, Seraphine had her hands on the manual detonator, a compact device clamped to the rebar at the column's base, wired to whatever secondary charges Renata had placed in the foundation's remaining structural points. She didn't detach it yet. She held it and waited, reading the space behind her through the acoustics of the chamber the way she'd learned to read every room she'd ever occupied. The water was at platform level now, cold and black and rising with the calm indifference of something that operated entirely outside of human drama. A foot of it across the chamber floor. The tunnel they'd entered through was submerged. The exit options had reduced to whatever structural gaps remained in the damaged south wall, accessible only through water that was getting deeper with every breath. Caruso had pulled the wounded soldier to higher ground, a ledge along the north wall, 2 feet above the current water line, original construction that looked like it would hold. Marco was there too, pressed against the stone, watching the platform with the expression of a man who has paid for his seat at a reckoning and intends to witness every second of it. Renata Foss sat on the platform's edge with her feet in the rising water, her composure finally, completely gone. Without the glasses and the pressed coat and the authority of her position, she looked like what she was. A very old woman in a flooding room whose 50-year architecture of manipulation had just reached its structural limit. Vittorio looked at his son standing in front of his weapon. "Move," he said. "No." "Lucien, move out of the—" "No." Lucien's voice was quiet and completely steady. The steadiness wasn't performance. It was the specific calm of a man who has identified the exact thing he's willing to die for and is no longer afraid of the information. "If you're going to shoot her, you go through me. That's the only way it happens." Vittorio's jaw worked. The weapon stayed up. The tremor came back briefly, and this time Lucien thought it wasn't the hand at all. It was something deeper, something in the chest or the shoulder, some seismic activity in the architecture of a man who had operated for 50 years without a fault line and was discovering, at 71, in a flooding stone chamber, that the fault line had been there the entire time. "She will destroy everything," Vittorio said. "You destroyed everything," Lucien said. "She's just the person standing at the end of it. The organization, the territories, the families depend—" "The families watched you send your personal unit to a syndicate banquet to kill a woman. The families are already done with you, Father. The only question is whether tonight produces a transition or a vacuum, and a vacuum is worse for everyone." Vittorio looked past Lucien at Seraphine. "You wanted acknowledgement," he said. His voice had found a register Lucien had never heard from him. Not soft. Nothing about Vittorio Viscari was soft, but reduced somehow. Stripped of the instruments of authority until what remained was something approaching the bare fact of one human being addressing another across a space defined entirely by what one of them had done to the other. "I've given it. I killed your family. I took your inheritance. I buried the evidence and built an empire on the ground and spent 25 years telling myself the mathematics of necessity justified the arithmetic of blood." He paused. "I'm not asking forgiveness. I'm not capable of asking for it. But I'm telling you that I know what I did." Seraphine stood at the east column with the detonator in her hands. She looked at Vittorio Viscari. She had imagined this moment more times than she could count, had constructed it in her mind during 12 years of Ada's kitchen and 9 years of solitary preparation and 2 years inside the walls of the man who was this monster's son. She had imagined herself cold, precise, weaponized, the instrument Ada had built her to be, executing a plan 25 years in the making with the clean finality of something inevitable. She hadn't imagined standing in cold water in a ruined dress with an old man's hand shaking around a gun pointed at the person who'd stepped between it and her. She hadn't imagined it feeling like this. "Your unit," she said. "The men who came through the gates 25 years ago, how many are still alive?" Vittorio didn't hesitate. 2. The rest died in the years after. "Where?" "Under organizational protection. New identities. One is in the north, one abroad." "You'll give Caruso the locations." Vittorio looked at Caruso on the ledge. Caruso looked back with the flat, careful attention of a man who had been processing the last 4 hours of information and had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected to land. "Yes," Vittorio said. "Renata Foss," Seraphine continued. "She faces legal accountability, every charge the evidence supports. You don't intervene, you don't obstruct, you don't protect her." On the platform edge, Renata made a sound, short, involuntary, the sound of a woman who had always been the one constructing the terms, and had just understood that she was no longer that person in this room. Agreed, Vittorio said. The Moretti network accounts. Full transfer of access and administrative control to me. Irrevocable, documented, witnessed. Agreed. The operational empire, the legitimate businesses, the real estate, the logistics companies, the import infrastructure. Transition into clean corporate structure under joint oversight with Lucien. The criminal operations, the territories, the enforcement, the extortion frameworks. Dissolved, formally. Not transferred, not rebranded, ended. Vittorio's face moved through something complex and then settled into the specific stillness of a man accepting the final terms of a negotiation he'd lost. That will take time, he said. It will take whatever time it takes. You'll cooperate with every step. And my son. Your son makes his own choices. Vittorio looked at Lucien. The weapon had drifted incrementally away from its line, not lowered, not surrendered, but no longer aimed. The drift of a man whose purpose had been redirected by something he couldn't name precisely. And me, Vittorio said. Seraphine looked at him for a long time. The water climbed another inch. You don't get to die here, she said finally. That would be too simple. You live with what you agreed to. You watch the empire get dismantled. You cooperate with every process, every document, every accounting, and then you live with having done that however many years you have left. She paused. That's the sentence. Vittorio looked at her. He looked at the weapon in his hand. He lowered it. Not a dramatic gesture, no. No theatrical surrender, no moment staged for witnesses. He lowered it the way old men lower things they've been holding for too long, with the particular exhaustion of someone acknowledging, at last, that the holding itself had been the problem. The chamber groaned above them. A section of the vault shifted and a curtain of water came down along the south wall, heavy and cold, driving the level up by 3 inches in under 10 seconds. The ledge where Caruso and Marco and the wounded soldier were stationed was now only 6 inches above the water. We need to move, Caruso said. Now, the vault is going. Lucien turned. Seraphine, east wall, she said, above the column. There's a structural gap. Original ventilation shaft, 18 inches wide. It runs up 40 feet to a maintenance access at dock level. I found it on the blueprints 3 months ago. You had blueprints for this location. I had blueprints for every location that mattered. She was already moving toward the east column, pulling herself up onto a stone ledge that ran along the wall above the waterline. It was sealed with a wooden panel. 25-year-old wood in a wet environment. It won't hold against force. Lucien looked at the vault above them. Another crack was spreading in real time, water sheeting through it in a thin, bright line that said the full pressure of what was above hadn't arrived yet, but was close. Go, he said to Caruso. Get the soldiers up first. The next 14 minutes were the most purely physical of the night, and the night had already produced its share of physical demands. The ventilation shaft was exactly as miserable as 18 inches of vertical stone could be, requiring a combination of back-bracing technique and upper body strength, and the specific tolerance for confined spaces that either you had or you didn't. The wounded soldier went up second, supported from below by Caruso, until he could find purchase with his good arm. Marco went up with the mechanical determination of a man whose body was 50 years old and whose will was something else entirely. Renata Foss didn't attempt to run. She sat on the platform with the water at her hips and waited with the resigned patience of someone who had run every available calculation and found no exit. When Lucien told her she was going up the shaft, she went without argument, the compliance of someone for whom resistance had become a concept without operational meaning. Vittorio went up without being asked. Lucien went last. The shaft was cold stone against his back and his hands and his face when he had to turn, and the sound of the chamber below was an education in what large enclosed spaces do when they fill with water. Not a roar, but a deep, resonant surge, the stone amplifying the frequency into something that felt less like sound and more like pressure, like the building itself was breathing its last. He came out of the shaft into a maintenance access crawl space at dock level, pushed through a rusted panel, and emerged into the pre-dawn air of Pier 17's service road. The rain had stopped, not reduced, stopped completely, with the finality of weather that has made its point and moved on. The dock surface steamed faintly where the cold air met the water-soaked concrete. The harbor lay dark and flat beyond the pier's edge, the night's chop settling into something calmer. To the east, barely perceptible, the sky had begun its preliminary negotiation with dawn, not light yet, but the first withdrawal of pure darkness, the horizon separating fractionally from the water. They stood on the dock, 9 of them: Lucien, Seraphine, Caruso, Marco, 2 soldiers, the wounded man, Renata Foss, and Vittorio Vescari, the architect of a 50-year empire and the survivor of the dynasty he'd destroyed, standing on a wet dock in the hour before dawn with the organization between them in pieces. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The harbor moved. A container vessel was working its way toward the outer channel, its running lights patient and deliberate, going somewhere that had nothing to do with any of this. Lucien looked at his father. Vittorio stood apart from the group by 6 feet. Not isolation, not rejection, just the instinctive spatial grammar of a man who had always occupied the center of rooms and was, for the first time, unsure of where the center was. He looked old. This was the thought that arrived in Lucien's mind with the specific surprise of seeing something obvious for the first time. His father looked old. Not infirm, not broken, nothing so dramatic as that. Just old. The particular diminishment that happened to powerful men when the thing that had been making them seem larger than their physical dimensions was removed. Without the authority, without the weapon, without the architecture of threat and consequence that had surrounded him for 50 years, he was a 71-year-old man in a wetsuit standing on a cold dock. Lucien thought about the rain at his mother's graveside. He thought about a hand holding his, size large, warm, steady, and the sound of grief that he'd believed his entire life was real. He still believed it was real. That was the complicated thing. He believed his father had genuinely grieved his mother and genuinely ordered her death, and had held both of those things in the same hand for 25 years without fracturing. Not because he was a monster, exactly, or not only because of that, but because he was a man who had decided, at some fundamental level, that what he was building mattered more than anything it required him to destroy, and who had been wrong in a way that had taken a lifetime to fully account. The locations, Lucien said, the 2 surviving unit members. Vittorio reached into his jacket, produced a phone, typed something, sent it to a number Lucien recognized as Caruso's backup line. "Done," he said. "The Moretti estate documentation. The original deed records and asset inventories that were absorbed in the transition. Renata will know where they're held." Renata looked at her feet. "Held in a secure archive under the Vescari family trust. I have the access codes." "You'll provide them to Caruso?" "Yes," Renata said. "And the banking network formal transfer. We need legal documentation." "I can draft it," Renata said, something strange in her voice. The reflex competence of a woman whose professional instincts operated independently of the wreckage of everything else. "Given the offshore jurisdictions, it will need—" "You'll draft it under Caruso's supervision," Seraphine said. "Every page reviewed before it's signed." Renata nodded. Seraphine was standing at the dock's edge, looking at the harbor. Her back was to the group, the champagne-stained gown under the stolen jacket, the silver ring on her finger catching the first fractional suggestion of the coming light off the water. Her hair had come down completely at some point during the night, during the tunnel, or the shaft, or the cathedral, and hung loose and damp around her shoulders. Lucien walked over and stood beside her. They stood together at the edge of the water, and neither of them spoke for a while. Behind them, the sounds of the group reorganizing, Caruso on the phone, Marco talking quietly to one of the soldiers, the wounded man sitting on the dock surface with his back against a pylon and his arm in a field wrap, managing his pain with the practiced self-containment of someone who knew better than to make it anyone else's problem. "Ada's letter," Lucien said. Seraphine didn't turn. "What about it?" "You said she called you her daughter." "She did." "And she raised you, 12 years." "Yes." "And she opened the gates." "Yes." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. The harbor moved. The container vessel had cleared the inner channel and was picking up speed in the open water, its light shrinking with distance. "I've been trying to decide," she said, "whether you can love something and destroy it at the same time. Whether those two things can genuinely coexist, or whether one of them is always a lie." She paused. "I watched your father lower his gun tonight. I watched his hand shake, and I believed, in that moment, that he genuinely loves you. And he killed your mother, and he massacred my family, and he spent 50 years treating human lives as variables in a calculation." Another pause. "So I think the answer is yes. I think they coexist. I think that's what makes people genuinely dangerous. Not the ones who destroy without caring, but the ones who care and destroy anyway because they've decided something else matters more." "Ada cared and destroyed," Lucienne said, "and then spent 12 years trying to repair it the only way she could think of." Seraphine's thumb moved against the scar on her palm. "Which was building me, which was giving me the ring and the skills and the architecture to do what she couldn't." She looked at the ring. "I don't know if that was love or guilt or both or neither. I know that I'm here. I know I'm alive. I know that the woman who opened the gates also saved me from the people who came through them." She exhaled. "I've decided to not know the rest. I've decided that is as much resolution as that particular thing is going to give me, and I have to be enough of an adult to accept unresolved things." Lucien said nothing. He looked at the water. "Your mother," Seraphine said. "Yes. He loved her." "I know." "And killed her." "I know." She turned her head and looked at him. In the pre-dawn light, his profile was very still. The jaw, the pale eyes, the particular quality of containment he wore like a second skin. She'd studied this face for 2 years from behind the mask of the quiet wife, reading it for tactical information, cataloging its expressions the way she cataloged exits. She knew it in the analytical way you know a map. She didn't know it the way she was looking at it now. "How are you?" she said. The question was so simple and so unexpected in this context that Lucien turned to look at her, as if he needed to verify that it was a genuine inquiry rather than an operational assessment. "I don't know," he said. "That's honest. I feel like I've been driving a vehicle for 34 years that turned out to have been going in the wrong direction the entire time. And I've stopped the vehicle and gotten out. And now I'm standing on the road." He looked back at the water. "I don't know what the road is. I don't know where it goes from here." "Neither do I," Seraphine said. "I've been moving toward a destination for 25 years, and I've arrived, and the destination isn't what I thought it was. It's not a feeling, it's a dock. It's a wet dock at 4 in the morning with a flooded cathedral underneath it and a lot of paperwork ahead. A beat. I don't know what comes after a 25-year plan either." "We figure it out," Lucien said. "We," she said, returning the word to him the same way he'd returned us to her in the parking structure's stairwell hours ago. "Unless you'd prefer to handle the transition of a $4 billion multinational banking network and the dissolution of a 50-year criminal organization on your own," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not exactly, but the thing that lived adjacent to it in people who'd lost the reflex and found it again unexpectedly in the worst possible context. Brief, low, real. "I'd prefer help," she said. He nodded. "Then you have it." Behind them, Caruso's voice cut through the dock's quiet. "Vehicle coming, our people. We have a safe house 30 minutes south. Lucis Chaponquet Soe, Vittorio." His father looked at him. "You ride with Caruso. You stay available. You don't make any contact with organizational members without going through me first." Vittorio looked at the conditions being laid on him by his son in a flat, operational tone with no room for objection and no performance of deference. Just the clear structural reality of a new arrangement being stated for the record. "Understood," Vittorio said. It cost him something to say it. Lucien saw the cost clearly. He didn't take satisfaction from it. He noted it and moved on, because there was nothing to be gained from the prolonged observation of a man's diminishment, even a man who had diminished so many others. Renata Foss was placed in the second vehicle under the supervision of 2 soldiers. She sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the passing city with the expression of a woman mentally drafting documents, because that was the only mode she had left, and she was apparently going to inhabit it until the law made its formal claim on her, which Caruso had already been on the phone arranging through channels that operated in the complicated space between organized crime and prosecutorial agreement. Marco walked alongside Seraphine toward the vehicles. He stopped before she reached the door. "After this," he said, "after the transition is done. The documentation, the accounts, all of it." He looked at his hands, the same gesture he'd made in the sub-basement, the private audit that some people couldn't stop performing. "I'll give a full statement, everything I know, the night of the massacre, my role, names, locations, timeline, whatever's needed to build the complete record." Seraphine looked at him. "It won't undo it," she said. "No," Marco said. "It won't. And it won't bring them back." "No." "Then why?" Marco looked at her. He was 50 years old and tired in the specific way of someone who had been carrying a particular weight for 25 years. And she was 32 and tired in the same way. And they stood on a wet dock in the early dark and looked at each other across the geography of what connected them, which was also the geography of what had destroyed everything worth connecting. "Because the record should be complete," Marco said. "Because your family existed. Because they had names, and those names should be in a document somewhere that says exactly what happened to them and why." He paused. "Your mother's name. Your father's. Your brother's." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. "Raphael," she said. "My father's name was Raphael. My mother was Elena. My brothers were Cosimo and Dante. Cosimo was 8 and Dante was 6. She said the names carefully, with the particular precision of someone handling things that break. "I haven't said their names out loud to anyone in 25 years. Marco absorbed this. "I'll make sure they're in the record," he said. Seraphine nodded once. She got in the vehicle. The convoy moved south through the city as the first light began its serious work on the horizon. Not dramatic. Dawn in this city was rarely dramatic, just the gradual replacement of one kind of dark with another. The night's particular quality of shadow, giving way to the gray-blue of very early morning, the outlines of buildings and streets, and the harbor edge becoming legible again after the long obscurement of the night. Lucien sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. Seraphine sat behind him. Caruso drove. Nobody spoke for a long time. The city moved past the windows. Delivery trucks making their early rounds. A man walking a dog. A woman running on the harbor path with headphones in, her breath visible in the cold, occupying a morning that had no knowledge of what had happened beneath it during the night. The ordinary persistence of the world continuing its ordinary business alongside catastrophe, the way it always had and always would. Lucien watched the city. He thought about the organizational infrastructure that would need to be dismantled piece by piece over months or years, the legal architecture Renata would help construct despite herself, the family councils that would need to be convened, and the territories that would need to be renegotiated, and the dozens of people whose livelihoods were tied to structures being ended and who would need somewhere else to go. He thought about the federal process, the careful negotiated approach that Caruso had contacts for, prosecutors who had been waiting for something exactly like this documentation for a decade. Who would handle it with the precision the situation required if handled correctly? He thought about Renata Foss sitting in the car behind him, drafting documents in her head, and how that was both her punishment and her usefulness, and how those two things were going to have to coexist for a while in a way that required vigilance. He thought about Marco's statement when it came, the names in the record. Raphael, Elena, Cosimo, Dante. 8 years old and 6 years old, and the specific weight of that arithmetic, which was not an abstraction and had never been an abstraction, and which the record would hold whether the feeling around it ever became bearable or not. He didn't think about his father. Not yet. That was a calculation he would make later, in some quieter hour, when the operational demands had reduced enough to allow the other kind of accounting. He knew the accounting was coming. He wasn't afraid of it. He was, for the first time in his life, genuinely uncertain what it would find, and the uncertainty felt more honest than any certainty he'd previously carried. At the safe house, a clean, unremarkable property 30 minutes south of the city, maintained by Caruso under a name that appeared on no Vescari organizational record. They arrived as the dawn committed itself fully to the eastern sky. Not warm light yet, the sun still below the horizon, but light nonetheless. The particular clarity of early morning that made everything look slightly more true than it had in the dark. The soldiers set up a perimeter. The wounded man was properly attended to by the field medic Caruso called in within the first 20 minutes. The wound was clean, the damage manageable, the prognosis straightforward in the practical way of injuries that miss the important structures. He would carry the scar. They all would carry the scars. Renata was secured in a back room with Caruso as her administrator, the document drafting begun in earnest. Vittorio was given a room with a window and a chair and a phone whose outgoing calls were monitored, and he sat in it and looked out at the property's overgrown garden with an expression that Lucien saw for exactly 3 seconds before he pulled the door shut and turned away and didn't examine further. Marco made a call to the Fontana family's senior leadership from the driveway. The call lasted 6 minutes. Lucien didn't listen. He trusted Marco was ending his professional relationship with a family he'd served as a penance for 25 years, and that the ending would be clean, because men like Marco, in Lucien's experience, only knew how to do one kind of ending. Seraphine was in the kitchen. She'd found a change of clothes somewhere in the safe house's emergency supplies. A plain dark sweater, trousers that were close enough to her size, wool socks. The champagne gown was folded on the counter with the careful respect you gave to objects that had carried you through something significant. She was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, real coffee, found in a cabinet and made in a machine that had been maintained against exactly this kind of necessity, looking out at the garden and the fence and the strip of dawn sky above the fence line. Lucien poured a cup of coffee and stood beside her. The garden was dead at this time of year. Gray stems and brown earth and the skeletal architecture of what had been growing things before the cold took them. But at the base of the fence, where the garden met the property's edge, something was coming up through the hard ground that had no business being there at this temperature and this hour. Small, green, precise. The first statement of something that had decided, against all available evidence, that now was the time. They looked at it for a while. "The families will want a meeting," Lucien said eventually. "Within the week. Castellano first, then the others. The transition needs to be presented as structured, not as a collapse." "I know," Seraphine said. "Castellano respected your family. He'll be the easiest entry point." "I know. I've been planning the sequencing since the banquet." "Of course you have." She drank her coffee. "The ring," Lucien said. She looked at her hand. The silver band with the coiled serpent and the 5 stars, tarnished and old. The engraving worn smooth in places by 25 years of handling. Only blood may wear it. Only death may take it. "What about it?" she said. "It's yours," he said. "Everything it represents. The network, the access, the authority. It was always yours." "I know. I want you to know that I know." She looked at him. He was still in the banquet suit, ruined by the night, wet from the cathedral, torn at the shoulder from the altercation on the platform, dark with harbor water at the cuffs. His jaw was bruised where the soldier's elbow had connected. His pale eyes in the morning light were tired and clear, and entirely without the armoring distance they'd worn for as long as she'd known his face. He looked like someone who had stopped performing something. She thought about 2 years of silence in a shared house. 2 years of meals alone and conversations that didn't happen, and the specific loneliness of being invisible to someone who was always present. She thought about what she'd told herself during those 2 years, that it was tactical, necessary, the acceptable cost of a mission that mattered more than comfort. She thought about whether she'd believed that entirely, or whether there had been, at some point in those 2 years, some evening in some hallway when she'd passed him and felt the distance between them as something other than useful. She thought about him stepping in front of the gun. That had not been tactical. "You stepped in front of him," she said. "Yes." "You could have moved. You had time." "Yes." "That was not a strategic decision." "No," he said. "It wasn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know what this is," she said. "Whatever this is, I don't have a framework for it. I've been running a 25-year operation, and the operation is over, and I am standing in a kitchen at 5 in the morning with no plan for what comes next, and that is, I don't have a word for what that is. Neither do I, he said. I need time, she said, to figure out who I am when I'm not moving towards something. I've been moving towards something since I was 16 years old. I know. That's not a rejection of, I know, he said. I'm not asking for anything. I'm standing in a kitchen drinking coffee. She looked at him. I'm standing in a kitchen drinking coffee, she said. Yes? They stood at the window and drank their coffee as the morning came fully in over the fence line, the dead garden holding its gray shapes in the new light, the small green thing at the base of the fence continuing its implausible arrival into the world. The city would be waking soon. People would be reading about explosions at the Viscari estate. Phones would be ringing in the houses of syndicate families. The machinery of consequence was already turning, would keep turning for months and years, through legal processes and organizational negotiations, and the slow, deliberate work of dismantling something that had been built on catastrophe and trying to determine what, if anything, could be constructed on cleaner ground. All of that was real and all of that was coming, and none of it was simple. But for this specific hour, in this specific kitchen, with the coffee going cold in their hands and the morning light finding the silver ring on her finger and the bruise forming on his jaw and the garden showing its first green entirely against the odds of the season, for this hour there was just the window and the quiet and the particular quality of two people standing close together after a long night, each carrying what they carried, neither pretending it was lighter than it was. Somewhere in the house, Caruso's voice was giving instructions to someone on the phone. Somewhere beyond the fence, the city was opening its eyes. Somewhere under 30 feet of harbor water, the foundation of the Moretti Cathedral was completing its return to the dark it had occupied for 2 centuries before the men who built empires on other people's blood had tried to make it serve their purposes. Seraphine set down her coffee cup. She took the silver ring from her finger. Lucienne watched without speaking. She turned it in her fingers once. The engraving, the coiled serpent, the 5 stars, the worn inscription on the inner band. She held it up to the window light and looked through it at the garden outside, the way a child looks through a glass ring at the world and finds it altered. Then she put it back on, not because she had to, not because it was a symbol of power or a tool of access or the instrument of a 25-year plan. She put it back on because it was her mother's and her father's and her brother's and hers. And the dead deserved to be carried by the living not as a weight, but as a name. Not as an obligation, but as the specific and irreducible fact of their having existed in the world. Raphael, Elena, Cosimo, Dante. She kept them. Outside, the first clean light of morning crossed the garden fence and found the ground, and the small green thing at the fence's base turned toward it with the absolute, uncomplicated certainty of something that didn't know yet how difficult the growing would be and was going to do it anyway. Lucien looked at it. Then he looked at Seraphine. And for the first time in 34 years of operating inside an empire built on everything wrong and calling it strength, Lucien Viscari did something his father had never taught him and couldn't have because it required the specific courage of a man who has lost everything he was given and found, in the losing the first clean ground he'd ever stood on. He said nothing. He just stood there, in the morning, with her, and let it be enough.